Hello, everyone. Oops. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our reading of Pride and Prejudice. We're doing the 2005 movie version. And with us today, we have Kenzie here is going to be doing our scene description, and she's going to be Miss Charlotte Lucas. I will be Miss Elizabeth Bennet. My name is Anne. Casey is going to be Miss Jane Bennet and Mrs. Gardner for us today. We've got Karina, who's going to be Miss Kitty Bennet and Mrs. Hill and a maid. Miss Jessica Ash in the house is going to be Miss Lydia Bennet, the most annoying Bennet sister, and Miss Georgiana Darcy. And then we've got Dakota here. She's going to be Mary Bennet and the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And Travis is going to be Mr. Bennet and Colonel Fitzwilliam. And we've got Jack with us. He is our Mr. Bingley and Mr. Gardner. And then Hunter is our Mr. Darcy today. And Jeremy is going to be playing several roles as Sir William Lucas, Mr. Collins, and Mr. Wickham. And then Molly, the lovely Molly, is going to be Mrs. Bennet, Miss Caroline Bingley. Actually, no, she's the worst character in this. And Mrs. Reynolds. I still love you guys. This is gonna be fun. So yeah, let's do our best British accents. Go ahead and take it away.
All right. Pride and Prejudice by Deborah McGotch. Revisions by Lee Hall. Inside of a Netherfield mansion, a vast mansion is coming to life. Maids pull dust sheets off furniture, servants open shutters, sunshine spills into the great rooms of Netherfield. Outside, a glimpse of rolling parkland. Title: It is a truth universally acknowledged. It's a whirlwind of activity. Servants bustle around, sweeping and polishing, readying the house for its new occupants. The shutters of a room are opened onto the imposing gardens. A coach pulls up, and through the window we see a young man get out. The title continues that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. A white sheet is pulled from a spinet and obscures our vision. Cut to the Longbourn house. Elizabeth Bennet, 20, good-humored, attractive, clearly nobody's fool, walks through a field of tall meadow grass. She is reading a novel entitled First Impressions. She approaches Longbourn, a fairly run-down 17th century house with a small moat around it. Elizabeth jumps up onto a wall and crosses the moat by walking a wooden plank. A reckless trick learned in early childhood. She walks past the back of the house where, through an open window to the library, we see her mother and father, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet.
My dear Mr. Bennet, have you heard that Netherfield Park is let at last?
We follow Elizabeth into the house, but still overhear her parents' conversation.
Do you not want to know who has taken it?
As you wish to tell me, I doubt I have any choice in the matter.
As Elizabeth walks through the hallway, we hear the sound of piano scales plodding through the afternoon. She walks down the entrance hall past a room where Mary, 18, the blue stocking of the family, is practicing, and finds Kitty, 16, the second youngest, and Lydia, 15, the precocious baby of the family, are listening at the door to the library.
Have you heard? Mr. Bingley, a young man from the north of England, has come down on Monday at a chaise and four.
With 5,000 a year.
Jane, the eldest, most beautiful, and most charmingly naive of the girls, joins them at the door.
Goodness.
And he's single, to be sure.
Inside the library, Mr. Bennet is trying to ignore Mrs. Bennet.
What a fine thing for our girls.
How can it affect them?
My dear Mr. Bennet, how can you be so tiresome? You know that he must marry one of them.
Oh, so that is his design in settling here.
Mr. Bennet takes a book from his table and walks out of the library into the corridor where the girls are gathered, Mrs. Bennet following. Mr. Bennet walks through the girls to the drawing room, pursued by Mrs. Bennet.
So you must go and visit him at once.
Inside the drawing room, Mr. Bennet walks to the bookshelf to replace the book he is carrying. Mary is practicing the piano. The girls come in to listen.
Oh, yes, Papa.
Please, Papa.
There is no need, for I already have.
The piano stops, a frozen silence. They all stare.
You have? When? How can you tease me, Mr. Bennet? You have no compassion for my poor nerves.
You mistake me, my dear. I have a high respect for them. They are my constant companions these 20 years.
Is he amiable?
Is he handsome?
He's sure to be handsome.
With 5,000 a year, it would not matter if he had a big pink face.
I will give my hearty consent to his marrying whichever of the girls he chooses.
Will he come to the ball tomorrow?
I believe so.
I have to have your spotted muslin, please.
I need it.
If you do, I'll lend you my green slippers.
Mr. Bennet winks at Elizabeth and turns to Mary, a serious, somewhat pedantic young girl.
And what do you say, Mary? Are you not excited by the prospect of a ball?
Society has claims on us all, Papa. As long as I have my mornings to myself, I consider an interval of recreation and amusement as quite desirable.
Inside of the assembly rooms at Meryton Village, at night, the local subscription dance is in full swing. It's a rough and ready, though enthusiastic affair, full of farmers, small-time squires with their ruddy-cheeked daughters. Lydia and Kitty, with their mother, are fussing around over their clothes, straightening their dresses, tidying their hair, and so on.
I literally can't breathe. It's so tight.
My toes hurt.
Elizabeth and Jane are a little apart from their family. Jane looks breathtaking.
Well, if every man in this room does not in the evening completely in love with you, I am no judge of beauty.
Oh, men.
Oh, they are far too easy to judge.
They are not all bad.
Humorless poppycocks in my limited experience.
One of these days, Lizzie, someone will catch your eye, and then you'll have to watch your tongue.
And eat my hat.
She stops speaking and stares. A dazzling group enters the room. George Bingley, 25, a good-hearted soul but prone to bumbling embarrassment when his enthusiasms get the better of him. His sister Caroline, 23, a victim of every latest fashion, counting herself superior to most of the company she encounters. And finally, Mr. Fitzwilliam Darcy, 27, dashing, brooding, with an introversion which could be misconstrued as haughtier. They are dressed in the highest fashion. Darcy surveys the hall. He catches Elizabeth's eye. She stares with a kind of surprised shock. Jane notices and looks at Darcy. He turns away.
Luckily, you're not wearing a hat.
A hush falls as the local people turn to stare. The newcomers, creatures from another world, make quite a stir. Cut to Caroline Bingley, standing next to Darcy, gazes at the somewhat provincial gathering with distaste.
We are a long way from Grosvenor Square, are we not, Mr. Darcy?
He does indeed look superior to the assembled company. On the dance floor, a young couple, staring at the newcomers, trip over each other, stumble, and burst out laughing. Mr. Bingley spots Jane Bennet. For a moment, he forgets himself and openly looks at her.
I find it very charming.
My brother, so easily pleased, is he not?
Darcy doesn't answer. Cut to, Elizabeth has found her great friend, Charlotte Lucas, an intelligent, sensible woman in her late 20s. They spy on the crowd.
So which of the painted peacocks is our friend Mr. Bingley?
He is on the right, and the left is his sister.
And the person with the disagreeable expression?
That is his good friend, Mr. Darcy.
Poor soul.
On the contrary, he has 10,000 a year and half of Derbyshire. Cut to Sir William Lucas, 53, a hale but unsophisticated member of the self-made gentry, takes it upon himself to introduce Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy to his daughter, Charlotte, and the Bennet family.
My eldest daughter, you know, Mrs. Bennet, Miss Jane Bennet, Elizabeth, and Miss Mary Bennet.
Oh, your mic's off.
There it goes. All right. Where are we? There we go. It is a pleasure. I have 2 other daughters. They are already dancing.
Delighted to make your acquaintance.
And may I introduce Mr. Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire.
A stiff bow from Darcy. Elizabeth smiles. Darcy does not. Cut to moments later. Elizabeth is standing in a small group with Jane, Bingley, Miss Bingley, and Darcy. Bingley can't keep his eyes off Jane, but is frightfully at a loss in disguising his instant ardor.
How do you like it here in Hertfordshire, Mr. Bingley?
Very much.
The library at Netherfield, I've heard, is one of the finest in the country.
Yes, it fills me with guilt.
He looks at Jane. A little blush starts around his collar.
Not a good reader, you see. I like being out of doors. I mean, I can read, of course.
His sister steps in as the blush threatens to engulf his ears.
Your library at Pemberley, Mr. Darcy, is astonishingly good.
Thank you. It is the work of many generations.
And then you have added so much to it yourself.
I wish I read more, but there always seems so many other things to do.
That's exactly what I meant.
Cut to Mr. and Mrs. Bennet stand a little apart from Elizabeth and the other young people. Lydia and Kitty bound up to them in a state of high excitement.
Mama, the regiment is arriving next week.
And we'll be here for the whole winter. Miss Forrester told us.
They're going to be stationed in the village.
Cut to Bingley turns to Jane.
May I have the honor?
They leave to dance.
Do you dance, Mr. Darcy?
But if I can help it.
Elizabeth, Darcy, and Miss Bingley stand in silence as they overhear the following. Cut to.
Officers, lots of officers.
How will we meet them?
It's easy. You just walk up and down in front of them and drop something.
Lydia pantomimes the actions for Kitty.
They pick it up, you say, "Oh, thank you, sir," and blush prettily, and then you're introduced.
I have long suspected that we have 2 of the silliest girls in the country.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, I remember the time when I liked a red coat myself, and if a smart young colonel with 6,000 a year should want one of my girls, I shall say nay to him.
Mr. Darcy overhears this. Profoundly embarrassed, Lizzie moves away. Cut to the dance floor. Mr. Bingley is dancing with Jane. His ears are blushing with thrilled embarrassment. Mrs. Bennet, with a group of other mothers, watches the young couple with rather too obvious satisfaction.
That dress becomes her, does it not? Though, of course, my Jane needs little help from couriers.
Elizabeth wanders through the throng. She looks at Bingley and Jane ending the dance. She is coy and demure. He clearly is smitten. Cut to Darcy is joined by Bingley, exhilarated by the dance.
Come, Darcy, I must have you dance. I hate to see you standing by yourself in this stupid manner.
You know how I detest it.
Upon my word, I've never seen so many pretty girls in my life.
You are dancing with the only handsome girl in the room.
Oh, she is the most beautiful creature I've ever beheld. But her sister, Elizabeth, is very agreeable.
They have stopped at the edge of the dance floor and have not seen Elizabeth and Charlotte, who are standing close behind them. Elizabeth smirks as she overhears their conversation.
Perfectly tolerable, I dare say, but not handsome enough to tempt me. You had better return to your partner and enjoy her smiles, for no wasting your time with me.
Bingley goes off. Cut to Elizabeth and Charlotte, who have overheard Darcy and Bingley's exchange. Ignore him, Lizzie. He's such a disagreeable man. It would be a misfortune to be liked by him.
Don't worry, I will not dance with him for half a Derbyshire.
Cut to later Bingley politely dancing with Charlotte. As he does so, he catches sight of Jane dancing with somebody else. A look of pure longing, but he cannot dance every dance with her. Lizzie, too, is dancing and clocks this. Lydia and Kitty are exuberantly dancing too, laughing and chatting. Darcy stands watching, a look of infinitely superior boredom on his fine features. Cut to Bingley is standing with Jane, Elizabeth, Mrs. Bennet, and Darcy.
Your friend, Miss Lucas, is a most amusing young woman.
Yes, I adore her.
It is a pity she is not more handsome.
Mama!
But Lizzie will never admit she is plain. Of course, it's my Jane who's considered the beauty of this country.
Oh, Mama, please.
When she was only 15, there were gentlemen so much in love with her that I was sure he would make her an offer. However, he did write her some very pretty verses.
And so hindered their affection. I wonder who first discovered the power of poetry in driving away love.
I thought that poetry was the food of love.
Of a fine stout love it may. Everything nourishes what it is strong already, but it is only a thin, slight sort of love of inclination. I'm convinced that one good sonnet will starve it away entirely.
Darcy looks at Elizabeth with surprise, a glimmering of interest.
So, what do you recommend to encourage affection?
Dancing, of course, even if one's partner is barely tolerable.
She gives him a dazzling smile. Darcy looks startled. He has no idea that she heard him and blushes. Cut to Elizabeth is dancing happily in a round. Jane and Bingley are also in the same dance. At the edge of the dance floor, Darcy is watching. Interior bedroom at Longbourn that night. Elizabeth and Jane are both tucked up in the same bed, but are too excited to sleep.
Mr. Bingley is just what a young man ought to be. Sensible, good-humoured.
Handsome, conveniently rich.
You know perfectly well I do not believe marriage should be driven by thoughts of money.
I agree entirely. Only the deepest of love will persuade me into matrimony, which is why I will end up an old maid.
Do you really believe he liked me, Lizzie?
Jane, he danced with you most of the night.
I was flattered, I must admit. I did not expect such a compliment.
That is one great difference between us. Compliments always take you by surprise. Well, Mr. Bingley is certainly very amiable, and I give you leave to like him. You've liked many stupider person.
Lizzie.
You're a great deal too apt to like people in general, you know. All the world is good and agreeable in your eyes.
Not his friend. I still cannot believe what he said about you.
Mr. Darcy, I could more easily forgive his vanity if he not had wounded mine. But no matter, I doubt we will ever speak again.
She blows out the candle. At breakfast the next morning, Mrs. Bennet presides over breakfast with an endless description of the ball. Mary is doing some needlework, whilst Lydia, Kitty, and Jane blearily eat.
And then he danced a third with Miss Lucas, poor thing. It is a shame she is not more handsome. The fourth with Miss King, of little standing, and fifth again with Jane.
If he'd had any compensation from me, he would have sprained his ankle in the first dance.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, anybody would think the girls looked forward to a grand inheritance.
Elizabeth rolls her eyes at Mr. Bennet. They've heard this speech a million times before.
Kitty, be so kind as to pass the butter.
As you well know, Mr. Bennet, when you die, which may in fact be very soon, our girls will be left without a roof over their head nor a penny to their name.
Oh, Mother, please, it's 10 in the morning.
Mrs. Hill enters the room and interrupts Mrs. Bennet's babbling.
A letter addressed to Miss Bennet, ma'am, from Netherton Hall.
Praise the Lord, we're saved.
She gives the letter to Jane.
Make haste, Jane. Make haste. Oh, happy day.
It is from Miss Bingley.
Mrs. Bennet stops in her tracks.
She has invited me to dine with her. Her brother will be dining out.
This is most unfortunate.
I didn't think he was so good looking anyway.
Can I take the carriage?
Certainly not, dear. You will go to Netherfield Hall on horseback.
Horseback?
Mrs. Bennet leaves with a secret smile on her lips. Outside in the countryside later that day, Jane rides through the countryside, a distant rumble of thunder. She looks up. Outside in a field, an open book, plop, plop, raindrops fall on it. Drawing back, we see Lizzie walking through a field reading. She looks up to the sky. At Longbourn that day, Mrs. Bennet stands at the kitchen door. A boy is delivering meat. It starts to rain. She puts out her hand to check.
Ah, good.
The housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, who is with her, looks bemused at her mistress's reaction. Outside in the garden, a louder rumble of thunder. A washerwoman hastily pulls clothes from the line. It's bucketing down heavily now. And outside Meryton Village, In the local village, people run for cover. Shopkeepers cover their wares. Outside of Longbourn, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet look out at the pouring rain.
Excellent. Now she will have to stay the night, exactly as I predicted.
Good grief, woman. Your skills in the art of matchmaking are without question.
Though I don't think, Mama, you can reasonably take credit for making it rain. Let's hope she hasn't caught her death before she gets there.
Inside of Netherfield, a footman opens the great doors to find Jane standing there soaked. She sneezes. Inside the drawing room at Longbourn, Elizabeth reads a letter.
And my kind friends will not hear of me returning home until I am better. But do not be alarmed excepting a sore throat, a fever, a headache. There is nothing wrong with me. This is ridiculous.
Well, my dear, if your daughter does die, it will be a comfort to know it was all in pursuit of Mr. Bingley.
People do not die of colds.
Oh, she might as well perish with the shame of having such a mother. I'm going to Netherfield at once.
Nonsense! The horse is with Jane, and the girls took the carriage to town.
Then I will walk there. We should not leave Jane alone in her condition.
Walk! You will not be fit to be seen by the time you get there.
Why the devil not? We could have them all laid up at Netherfield Hall.
I will be fit for Jane, which is all I care about.
Outside in the countryside, Elizabeth strides across vast muddy hills, slipping as she goes. Netherfield is in view on the horizon. She stops to take it in, then carries on down even more down the muddy track. Inside of Netherfield, in the breakfast room, in the large grand dining room, Caroline Bingley and Darcy are eating breakfast. It's very formal, in fact, frigid, compared to the volatile Bennet household. Darcy is reading the newspaper. Caroline Bingley is reading a letter.
Apparently, Lady Buckhurst is redecorating her ballroom in the French style. I think a little unpatriotic, don't you?
Mr. Darcy is about to answer when the door opens. A footman appears, his face rigid with disapproval.
Miss Elizabeth Bennet.
Lizzie comes in, her face flushed, her skirt covered in mud. She looks ravishing. Darcy stares at her, then quickly rises to his feet. Caroline Bingley, astonished, looks her up and down.
Good Lord, Miss Bennet, have you walked here?
I'm so sorry. How is my sister?
She's upstairs. Show Miss Bennet the way, Alfred.
Lizzie leaves.
Goodness, did you see her petticoat? 6 inches deep in mud. And her hair, so fuzzy and untidy.
I think her concern for her sister does her credit.
Oh, yes, it's shocking to have a bad cold. I dislike excessively being ill myself.
In the Netherfield landing, Elizabeth is taken upstairs. Bingley, looking tense, waits outside her sister's room. His face lights up when he sees her.
Miss Elizabeth, oh, I'm so glad to see you.
A doctor comes out of Jane's room.
How is she?
Did I not sign a doctor?
A violent cold, but we shall get the better of it.
Inside of Netherfield in Jane's bedroom, Elizabeth goes into the bedroom and Jane is feverish and ill.
Jane!
Jane's face lights up and Elizabeth kisses her.
Lizzie, oh, your face is so cold. They're being so kind to me. I feel such a terrible imposition.
Don't worry. I don't know who is more pleased by your being here, Mama or Mr. Bingley.
Bingley comes in after having attended to the doctor.
Thank you for tending to my sister so diligently. It seems she is in better comfort here than she would be at home.
It is a pleasure. I mean, not to see her so sick, of course. That's terrible. I will have a room made up for you. You must be our guest here until Jane recovers.
Inside the drawing room, Darcy is quietly reading as Bingley paces about anxiously. Caroline berates him from the sofa.
Hey, she is a perfectly sweet girl, but save being an excellent walker, there's very little to recommend her.
I thought she showed remarkable spirit coming all this way.
The eldest Miss Bennet, as you know, I hold in excessive regard, and I wish her well settled, though I do fear with her family's low connections there's little chance of it. Their uncle is in trade, you know, in Cheapside.
If they had uncles enough to fill all Cheapside, it would not make them one jot less agreeable.
Outside in the garden of Longbourn, Mr. Bennet is overseeing the gardener who is pruning the hedge. Mrs. Bennet bustles up. She looks very pleased with herself.
Well, my dear, it's all going according to plan. He's a half in love with her already.
Who, my sweetest?
Mr. Bingley. And he doesn't mind that she hasn't a penny, for he has enough for the two of them.
Suddenly, a distant trumpet sounds. Dogs bark. The militia are arriving. Lydia and Kitty rush past. They are dressed up to the nines to greet the officers. Mrs. Bennet's face lights up.
Wait for me.
And she's gone. Mr. Bennet gazes at their departing figures. In the Meryton village, Mrs. Bennet and her two daughters rush down the street into the village. Dogs bark, children run alongside as a regiment of soldiers march through the street. Thieves scatter, shopkeepers stand in their doorways, the two Bennet girls simper at the handsome soldiers. Mrs. Bennet, flushed and excited, rushes past behind them. Lydia deliberately drops her handkerchief. One of the soldiers stands on it. She's appalled. Inside the drawing room at Netherfield, Elizabeth is reading a book. Darcy is reading a letter. Bingley is sat nervously. Caroline, obviously bored, wanders the room looking for distraction. She looks over at Darcy's shoulder.
You write uncommonly fast, Mr. Darcy.
No mistaken, I write rather slowly.
Caroline lingers annoyingly. Sorry.
How many letters you must have occasion to write, Mr. Darcy. Letters of business, too. How odious I should think of them.
It's fortunate, then, that they fall to my lot instead of yours.
Please tell your sister that I long to see her.
I've already told her once, by your desire.
Lizzie looks across from her book.
I do dote on her. I was quite in rapture at her beautiful little design for a table.
Perhaps you will give me leave to defer your raptures till I write again. At present, I have not enough room to do them justice.
Mr. Bingley now pacing anxiously around the room.
It's amazing how young ladies have the patience to be so accomplished.
What do you mean, Charles?
They all paint tables, embroider cushions, and play the piano. I never heard of a young lady, but people say she is accomplished.
The word is indeed applied too liberally. I cannot boast of knowing more than half a dozen women, in all my acquaintance, that are truly accomplished.
Nor I, to be sure.
Goodness, you must comprehend a great deal in the idea.
I do.
Absolutely. She must have a thorough knowledge of music, singing, drawing, dancing, and the modern languages to deserve the word, and something in her air and manner of walking.
And of course, she must improve her mind by extensive reading.
I am no longer surprised at your knowing only 6 accomplished women. I rather wonder how you know any.
Are you so severe on your own sex?
I never saw such a woman. She would certainly be a fearsome thing to behold.
Pause. Darcy goes back to his letter. Caroline Bingley picks up a book, pauses, puts it down. She walks over to Lizzie.
Miss Bennet, let us take a turn around the room.
Lizzie, surprised, gets up. Caroline Bingley links her arm and they start walking up and down.
It's refreshing, is it not, after sitting so long in one attitude?
And it's a small kind of accomplishment, I suppose.
Darcy meets Lizzie's eye briefly, then he goes back to letter writing. More walking up and down. Caroline Bingley turns to Darcy.
Mr. Darcy, will you join us?
You can only have 2 motives, Miss Bingley, and I would interfere with either.
What can he mean?
Our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it.
Please tell us.
Either you are in each other's confidence and have secret affairs to discuss, or you are conscious that your figures appear to the great disadvantage by walking. If the first, I should get in your way. The second, can admire you much better from here.
Oh, shocking. How shall we punish him for such speech?
We could always tease him.
Oh no, Mr. Darcy is not to be laughed at.
Are you too proud, Mr. Darcy? And would you consider that a fault?
I couldn't say.
For we're trying to find a fault in you.
Maybe it's that I find it hard to forgive the follies and vices of others, or their offenses against myself. My good opinion, once lost, is lost forever.
Oh dear, I cannot tease you about that. What a shame for our daily love to laugh.
A family trait, I think.
The next morning, Elizabeth wakes up next to Jane. Outside in the countryside, Darcy gallops through the countryside. Inside the stable, Darcy, exhausted, rides into the stable yard. In the corner is a trough and pump. He strides up to the pump, puts his head under it, and douses himself with cold water. Inside, this is intercut. From a window, Elizabeth looks out at Darcy. Darcy looks up for a second and catches Elizabeth looking down at him. He turns from the window. Jane is walking up.
Jane, do you think you might feel well enough to leave home today?
In the drawing room, the doors open. The butler, as before.
Mrs. Bennet, Miss Bennet, a Miss Bennet, and a Miss Bennet, sir.
Are we to receive every Bennet in the country?
Mrs. Bennet, Lydia, Mary, and Kitty are introduced to Caroline, Bingley, and Darcy. Elizabeth holds her breath as her mother launches into untold gaucheries.
What an excellent room you have, sir. Such expensive furnishings. I hope you intend to stay here, Mr. Bingley.
Absolutely. I found the country very diverting. Don't you agree, Darcy?
And it perfectly adequate, even if society's a little less varied than in town.
But I assure you, there is quite as much going on in the country as there is in the town.
Indeed, Mamma. I think Mr. Darcy merely meant that there were no such variety of people to be met in the country as there are in town, which you must acknowledge to be true.
Nonsense. We dine with 24 families. Sir William Lucas, for instance, is a very agreeable man, so very genteel and easy.
Mr. Bingley, is it true that you'll have promised to hold a ball here at the Netherfield?
Well,
It would be an excellent way to meet new friends. You could invite the militia.
We'll do hold a ball.
Kitty!
when your sister has recovered, you shall name the day.
I think a ball is a perfectly irrational way to gain new acquaintance. It would be better if conversation instead of dancing were the order of the day.
Indeed, much more rational, but rather less like a bowl.
Thank you, Mary.
Please, let me show you to Jane. You'll find her quite recovered.
Outside the driveway of Netherfield, the Bennets' carriage awaits. The Bingleys are gathered to see the Bennets off. Jane is radiant, in the peak of health.
Really, I don't know how to thank you.
Really, you're welcome any time you feel the least bit poorly.
Thank you so much for your stimulating company. It has been most instructive.
Not at all. The pleasure is all mine.
Elizabeth looks at Darcy, who does not say anything. She gets into the carriage.
Mr. Darcy?
Miss Bennet.
They share a look as Elizabeth joins the rest of the Bennets in the carriage. The driver takes off. Bingley waves enthusiastically to Jane.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Inside of the carriage, the family are all squeezed in rather tightly.
What a high and mighty man that Mr. Darcy is, quite eaten up with pride.
Outside of Marrington that day, the Bennets' carriage is stopped in its tracks by the militia who are marching en masse through town. Inside the carriage, Lydia cannot believe her eyes as row after row of soldiers pass by the carriage with not a few of the men looking in at the Bennet girls with some interest.
Can't believe it. There must be 1,000 of them.
Leading the one troop of militia is Wickham, a very handsome blonde officer. Lydia spots him and swoons.
Please, drive on.
Inside of Longbourn, as the Bennet girls come into the house, Lydia eulogizing the militia, they meet Mr. Bennet.
I hope, my dear, that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have reason to expect an addition to our family party.
Mr. Bennet holds up the letter. Inside the carriage, coming through Meryton, Collins, late 20s, and overweening sycophant, nervous and unctuous in equal measure. He sits in his black garb, hunched uncomfortably as he comes through town.
Dear sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late father over the entail to me of the Longbourn estate has long been a subject of much torment which I have frequently wished to heal. Having received ordination this Easter, and being so fortunately distinguished by the patronage of the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourgh?
Yep, de Bourgh. Colin's voice fades out as his carriage wipes through the frame, revealing Elizabeth and Charlotte on their way to the butcher's.
His name is Mr. Collins. He's the dreaded cousin.
Who's to inherit?
Indeed, everything apparently. He may leave us our stays, but even my piano still belongs to Mr. Collins.
When?
He can turn us out of the house as soon as he pleases.
But why?
Because the estate is entailed to him and not just poor females.
A cart passes, crammed with sheep going to slaughter. Inside the hallway at Longbourn, Mr. Collins is ushered by the manservant, Perkins. He looks around his future home with interest. Mr. and Mrs. Bennet greet him.
Mr. Collins, at your service. What a charming house, so convenient for the local village. And some very fine pieces, if I'm not mistaken.
They are.
Ah, these are your daughters, are they not?
We have some more somewhere.
I must congratulate you. I've heard much of their beauty, but in this instance, fame has fallen short of truth.
A very low bow. The girls are somewhat taken aback. Inside of the dining room at Netherfield, the Bennets and Collins are seated formally for supper. Mr. Collins is served some food.
What a superbly featured room, and what excellent boiled potatoes. It is many years since I've had such an wonderful vegetable, to which of my fair cousins should I compliment the excellence of cooking.
Mr. Collins, we are perfectly able to keep a cook.
Excellent. I'm very pleased the estate affords such a living. I'm honored to have, as my patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh. You have heard of her, I presume. My small rectory abutes her estate, Rosings Park, and she is often condescends to drive by my humble abode in her little phaeton and ponies.
Does she have any family?
One daughter, the heiress of Rosings and very extensive property. I have often observed to Lady Catherine that her daughters seem born to be a duchess, for she has all the superior graces of elevant rank. These are the kind of little delicate compliments that are always acceptable to ladies, and which conceive myself particularly bound to pay.
How happy for you, Mr. Collins, to possess the talent for flattering with delicacy.
Do these pleasing attentions proceed from the impulse of the moment, or are they the result of previous study?
They arise...
Jane kicks Elizabeth under the table. I felt like I should read that. Elizabeth tries not to laugh at Mr. Collins's answer.
They arise chiefly from what is passing at the time, and though I sometimes amuse myself with arranging such little elegant compliments, I always wish to give them as unstudied an air as possible.
Believe me, no one would suspect your manners to be practiced.
After dinner, I thought I might read to you all in an hour or two. I have with me Fortis's sermons, which speak eloquently on this point. Do you know Fortis's sermons, Miss Bennet?
Inside the quarter at Longbourn. Later, we can see the girls and Mr. Bennet gathered by the fire through the doorway. Mr. Collins leaves the room and takes Mrs. Bennet aside to a very discreet conference, out of hearing of anyone else.
Mrs. Bennet, you do know I have been bestowed by the good grace of Lady Catherine de Bourgh a parsonage of no mean size.
I have become aware of the fact.
Well, it is my avowed hope that soon I may find a mistress for it, and I have to inform you that the eldest, Miss Bennet, has captured my special attention.
Mr. Collins, unfortunately, it is incumbent on me to hint that the eldest Miss Bennet is very soon to be engaged.
Engaged?
But Miss Elizabeth, next to her, in both age and beauty, would make anyone an excellent partner. Do not you agree, Mr. Collins?
Indeed, a very agreeable alternative.
Outside in the back meadow, Elizabeth and Jane are walking towards the house when across the moat they see Mr. Collins come out of the house and advance towards them.
Oh no.
Mr. Collins spots them and darts through the door in the garden wall and hurries towards the bridge to meet them.
This way.
She pulls Jane across the duckboard spanning the moat, through the house, and out the front. Mr. Collins doubles back and follows them into the house. The girls are nowhere to be seen. He looks around, puzzled. Outside in Meryton Village that day, Jane and Elizabeth arrive in the village. Jane, forever the dutiful daughter, looks uneasy. Elizabeth is flushed and reckless. She looks behind them.
We've lost them.
They slow down to a walk and then stop. Outside the milliner's shop, the incorrigible Lydia and Kitty are chatting to Wickham, the dashing young officer we spotted earlier. He is utterly gorgeous, slim, handsome, tousled hair, the perfect romantic hero.
Kitty, Lydia!
We just happened to be looking for some ribbon, didn't we, Kitty? And we met Mr. Wickham.
Picked up Lydia's gloves.
He's a lieutenant.
I'm enchanted. Shall we all look at some ribbons together?
Oh, yes.
Inside the milliner's shop, they come into the shop. The others go towards the counter. Wickham hangs back and smiles a complicit, witty smile at Elizabeth. She colors.
I thought I must warn you I have very poor taste.
Only a man truly confident of himself would admit that.
No, it's true. My room's in town, decorated, I thought, in the height of fashion. I've reduced grown men to tears of mirth.
Then why don't you change them?
And deny people such pleasure?
So you don't mind being laughed at?
Not particularly.
It is somewhat of sterile quality, is it not, to be aware of one's importance in the world?
Especially if, like me, one has none.
Lizzie, please lend me some money.
You already owe me a considerable sum, Liddy.
Allow me to oblige.
Oh, no, please, Mr. Wickham.
Outside of the milliner's shop, the girls emerge from the shop with Wickham.
You're too generous.
I know. 5 pence halfpenny.
It all adds up.
We'll pay him back.
Oh, yeah. Yes. I'll make sure of that.
Elizabeth is really rather taken with him. They walk down the street.
Will you be stationed here all winter, Mr. Wickham?
That depends on what the French have in mind. Of course, I look forward to action, but on the other hand...
Lizzie, look! Mr. Bingley!
It is indeed Bingley, riding towards them. He's accompanied by Darcy. Bingley jumps off his horse and hurries over to Jane. His open, friendly face is filled with delight.
I was on my way to your house.
Please, Mr. Bingley, when are you going to give a ball?
Lydia!
I was just waiting until your sister was quite well.
She is.
Elizabeth pays no attention to the following conversation. Instead, she's looking at Darcy, who, in turn, is staring at Wickham. They both obviously recognize each other and look very uncomfortable.
When then?
As soon as they have made the white soup.
Be sure to invite Mr. Wickham.
Darcy turns and rides off without a word.
Lydia, you can't just say that.
Will you excuse me, ladies? Mr. Wickham, enjoy the day.
Elizabeth looks at Wickham, puzzled. Inside the drawing room at the Lucas's house, a small cards party is underway. 3 tables have been set up. Elizabeth, Wickham, Jane, Lydia, Kitty, Charlotte, and Sir William and Lady Lucas are present. A small number of officers and other ladies are also present. We move around the tables. Kitty is sat with Sir William and Charlotte and Mary. Jane sits at a table with Mr. Collins and Lady Lucas. Lizzie sits with Lydia and two other officers. Lydia flirts outrageously.
We have asked Mamma if we might have new dresses for the Netherfield ball.
Yes, white. They must be white.
White is the only color to be worn this season.
So I believe.
Mr. Collins is at a table with Lady Lucas. He glances over at Elizabeth as he talks.
Of course, when you understand that Lady Catherine de Bourgh is its proprietor, you will realize what an immense compliment that is. Lady Catherine spent £800 on a chimney piece alone.
Wickham, who has been talking to some of the other officers, comes and sits beside Elizabeth, passing by Mr. Collins on the way.
Your cousin is blessed with an uncommon capacity for charm.
Will you be attending the Netherfield ball, Mr. Wickham?
I hope to. How long has Mr. Darcy been a guest at Netherfield?
Elizabeth pounces on this reference to Mr. Darcy and takes her chance.
About a month. Are you acquainted with Mr. Darcy?
Indeed. My fate has been very intimate with that gentleman. I have been connected with his family since infancy. You may well be surprised, Miss Bennet, especially given the cold manner of our intimacy this afternoon. Are you well acquainted with that gentleman?
As much as I could ever wish to be. I have spent 4 days in the same house with him. I think him very disagreeable.
I cannot pretend to be sorry. But I really speak out of turn. Miss Elizabeth, I was just saying to Sir William what appalling weather we've been having.
Elizabeth cannot believe her misfortune in Mr. Collins, but she smiles politely.
I think I should take a little air.
She rises and walks through the room towards a balcony. As she passes the other tables, we follow and witness snippets of their conversations. It seems Mr. Wickham has met with universal approval, though Lizzie looks singularly pleased with him.
At the moment, she has more suitors than sense.
Charlotte looks over at Mr. Collins. Elizabeth passes Sir William's side of the table.
Now, any of you for a round of bridge? Elizabeth?
Really, I do need to take some air.
Mr. Collins makes his way to join Elizabeth.
Mr. Collins? Oh, I am not so familiar with this game, Sir William. Absolutely nonsense. I insist that you join us. Please, Mr. Collins, I'd happy if you'd that's not me.
Oh, that's me. Please, Mr. Collins, I'd be happy if you'd partner me. Collins resigns himself to his fate. Elizabeth smiles and slips out into the night air. Outside on the balcony, Elizabeth breathes in the cold night air. She senses someone join her. She looks round to see Wickham has followed her as she had hoped.
I hope your plans in favor of Meryton will not be affected by your difficult relations with the gentleman we were just speaking of.
Oh, no, it's not for me to be driven away. If he wishes to avoid seeing me, he must go, not I.
I must ask you, Mr. Wickham, what is the manner of your disapproval of Mr. Darcy?
Do you really want to hear? He ruined me.
How so?
My father mentioned his estate. We grew up together, Darcy and I. His father treated me like a second son. Oh, he was the kindest of men and bequeathed me the best living in his gift. For I had my heart set on joining the church, but when he died, Darcy ignored his wishes and gave the living to another man.
Why did he do that?
Out of jealousy, for his father loved me more than he loved him.
How cruel, are you sure?
And out of pride, for he considered me too lowly to be worth his consideration.
Inside of the bedrooms at Longbourn, we pan through the bedrooms as the Bennet girls prepare for the Netherfield ball. Kitty is helping Lydia into her dress. They are both wearing white.
Ah!
Breathe in.
We move to the quieter preparations of Jane and Elizabeth. This conversation has been going on for some time.
I still think there must have been a misunderstanding.
Oh, Jane, you never think ill of anybody.
How could Mr. Darcy do such a thing? I will discover the truth from Mr. Bingley at the ball this evening.
If it is not true, let Mr. Darcy contradict it himself. But until he does, I hope never to encounter him.
Poor unfortunate Mr. Wickham.
On the contrary, he is twice the man Mr. Darcy is.
And let's hope for you a rather more willing dancer.
Jane leaves Elizabeth at the mirror, taking very particular care of her makeup. She smiles to herself. Inside of Netherfield, the great doors of Netherfield open to reveal the ball in full swing. Compared to the somewhat clod-hopping assembly, it's a dazzling affair. There are hundreds of guests. All the women, roughly 200, are dressed in white. The men are either in red officer uniform or dressed in black and white. There are a number of rooms, each occupied by a different activity: cards, buffet, women's closet. The final and grandest room is the ballroom, a swirl of elegant dance. The Bennets enter the first reception room. The girls, including Mrs. Bennet, are all dressed in white. Mr. Collins is slightly detained as people pass. Mr. Bingley bounds up to Jane.
You're here. I'm so pleased.
And so am I.
How are you, Miss Elizabeth?
Elizabeth is not paying attention. Instead, she is searching over Mr. Bingley's shoulder for a sight of Wickham.
Are you looking for someone?
No, not at all. Admiring the splendor of the ball.
It is lovely, Mr. Bingley.
Bingley and Jane move off and leave Elizabeth with Mrs. Bennet and the others. While Mrs. Bennet talks, we focus on Elizabeth searching the sea of redcoats.
I dare say I have never met a more pleasant gentleman in all my years. Look how he dotes on her. Still, Jane has always done what is best for her family.
Elizabeth takes this opportunity to slip away into the next room. Elizabeth looks around but cannot see Mr. Wickham. Suddenly, she thinks she sees him, so she starts to move over. The man turns around. It's not Wickham, but someone else. Elizabeth walks nonchalantly into the next room, again looking for Mr. Wickham. She cranes around, trying to see him, and suddenly is surprised by Charlotte Lucas.
Have you seen Mr. Wickham?
Perhaps he's in the ballroom. They both walk into the ballroom. We pull back to reveal a sea of dancers. Wickham is nowhere to be seen. Jane appears and catches Elizabeth's arm.
He's not here. Apparently otherwise detained.
Detained?
Mr. Collins arrives, breathless. He smiles eagerly at Elizabeth.
There you are.
Mr. Collins, what a pleasant surprise.
Perhaps you will do me the honor, Miss Elizabeth.
Oh, I didn't think you danced, Mr. Collins.
I do not consider it incompatible with the office of a clergyman to indulge in such an innocent diversion. In fact, several people, her ladyship included, have complimented me on my lightness of foot.
Elizabeth's face is a matey rictus. I feel like I need to Google that. They dance, the style of which is not unlike English country dancing.
To be sure, dancing is of little consequence to me, but it does afford the opportunity to lavish one's partner with delicate attentions, which is my primary object of the evening.
Elizabeth turns as part of the dance, and for a moment she dances beside Jane.
Apparently your Mr. Wickham has been called on some business to town, though my informer told me he would have been less inclined to be engaged had it not been for the presence at Netherfield of a certain gentleman.
Jane indicates towards where Darcy is standing watching them.
That gentleman barely warrants the name.
The dance leads Elizabeth back to Mr. Collins.
It is my intention, if I may be so bold, to remain close to you throughout the evening.
Couples are preparing for the next dance. Elizabeth and Charlotte are standing to one side when Mr. Darcy approaches.
May I have the next dance, Miss Elizabeth?
You may.
Darcy walks away.
What was I thinking? Have I no presence of mind?
I dare say you will find him very agreeable, Lizzie.
Heaven forbid. That would be the greatest misfortune of all, to find a man agreeable whom one is determined to hate.
Elizabeth dances face to face with Darcy. Neither can speak. They dance for a moment in silence.
I do love a saraband.
Indeed, most invigorating.
It is your turn to say something, Mr. Darcy. I talked about the dance, now you ought to remark on the size of the room or the number of couples.
I'm perfectly happy to oblige. Please advise me of what you would like most to hear.
That reply will do for the present. Perhaps by and by I may observe that private balls are much pleasanter than public ones, but for now we may be silent.
Do you talk as a rule while dancing?
We are each of an unsocial, taciturn disposition, unwilling to speak unless we expect to say something that will amaze the whole room and be handed down to posterity with all the eclat of a proverb. So little lubrication to avoid embarrassment might be advantageous.
I see no striking resemblance of your own character in this, and there it is mine I cannot say. Tell me, do you and your sisters very often walk to Meryton?
They are suddenly parted by the choreography of the dance. We stay with Elizabeth, who is whisked round the floor by an elderly man who smiles at her toothlessly. That was not in the movie. Elizabeth looks back at Darcy, who is dancing with Lydia. He stares at Elizabeth as he dances. Elizabeth smiles at her current partner in embarrassment.
Very mild weather we've been having.
Sorry.
The dance spins again as she is back with Darcy.
Yes, we often walk to Meryton. It is a great opportunity to meet new people. In fact, when you met us, we had just had the pleasure of forming a new acquaintance.
I will admit your Mr. Wickham is blessed with such happy manners as he may ensure his making friends. Whether he is capable of retaining them is less certain.
He has been so unlucky to lose your friendship. I remember hearing you once say that your resentment once created was unappeasable. You are very cautious, I suppose, as to it being created?
I am. May I ask to what these questions tend?
To make out your character, Mr. Darcy.
And what have you discovered?
Very little.
The dance finishes.
I hear such different accounts of you as puzzle me exceedingly.
I hope to afford you more clarity in the future.
They bow to each other, and Elizabeth moves quickly away from Darcy. Elizabeth is at the buffet watching Kitty quaff a huge glass of wine, and having the glass immediately refilled, she is joined by Caroline Bingley, who also looks at Kitty disapprovingly.
Miss Elizabeth, let me recommend you as a friend not to give too much confidence to all of the assertions your friend Mr. Wickham might make. He is indeed a charming man, but one should never forget from where he is descended.
His lack of trustworthiness and descent appeared on your account to be the same thing.
Please excuse my ignorance. It was kindly meant.
A breathless Mr. Collin appears.
Is that Mr. Darcy of Pemberley in Derbyshire?
I believe so.
But I must make myself known to him immediately.
But sir?
He is the nephew of my esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine.
He is?
Mr. Collins starts making his way determinedly towards Darcy.
Please, Mr. Collins, he'll consider it an impertinence.
Elizabeth watches from a distance with acute embarrassment as Collins interrupts Darcy. Darcy does not notice him, so Mr. Collins raises his voice.
Mr. Darcy!
The room around him stops. Darcy is surprised and turns round. In Dumb Show, we see Darcy is horrified by Collins' obsequiousness. During the conversation, Collins points Elizabeth out to Darcy.
What an interesting relative you have, Miss Bennet.
Elizabeth walks away into another room. In the other room, where Mary is singing badly at the piano, Elizabeth is horrified. She turns to leave only to see Mr. Bennet looking on. He winces as Mary misses a high note. Mary finishes the song with an off-key flourish. Polite applause. Mary smiles and prepares for another song.
Aren't you going to do something?
Mr. Bennet walks over to the piano.
Mary dear, you've delighted us long enough.
But they asked for another song.
Let the other young ladies have a turn.
Later, Charlotte and Lizzie are sat together.
Perhaps my family have made a competition to see who can expose themselves to the most ridicule.
Well, at least Mr. Bingley has not noticed. They look over and see Jane and Bingley dancing. Bingley clearly besotted by Jane.
Yes, I think he likes her very much.
Oh, shoot, that is me. Whenever I don't see scene direction, I'm like, oh, I can take a breath. All right. But she does not like him. There are a few of us who are secure enough to be really in love with proper encouragement. Bingley likes her enormously, but might not do more if she does not help him on.
She is just shy and modest. If he did not perceive her regard, he is a fool.
We are all fools in love. He does not know her character as we do. She should move fast, snap him up. There is plenty of time for us to get to know them after we're married. Elizabeth looks over the dance floor to see Lydia dancing with a soldier. She's a little drunk and very flirtatious. He says something and she shrieks with laughter. All right, montage of the ball. Elizabeth sits at the side of the dance floor. She looks at Mrs. Bennet dancing in outrageous fashion. Cut to later, Lydia is getting more and more leery with a group of soldiers. Elizabeth walks away in embarrassment, only to see Mr. Collins smiling at her from across the room. Cut to Elizabeth dancing joyously with the excruciating Mr. Collins as she turns in the dance and sees Darcy look on with obvious disdain. Cut to much later, the band are exhausted, guests are leaving. The staff are asleep on their feet. Elizabeth almost alone, watching her parents dancing almost. The only people left on the dance floor. Kitty is asleep over Elizabeth's lap. This is a never-ending nightmare. Inside the entrance hall to Netherfield, daylight creeps through the curtains. Mrs. Bennet is sprawled on the sofa. Lydia is completely drunk. Kitty is asleep. Jane is sitting demurely. Collins looking longingly at Elizabeth. Mrs. Bennet is holding court whilst the footmen behind are literally ready to drop. Bingley is standing, the perfect host, but obviously willing the Bennets to leave.
I have never had such a good time in my life. Mr. Bingley, we must have such a ball once a month at least.
Caroline, who is standing with her brother, yawns ostentatiously.
Mother, I really think it's time to go.
Don't be impertinent. Our hosts are perfectly happy with our company. Are you not, Mr. Bingley? I hope I can entice you to Longbourn to sample our hospitality. We would make sure you had 3 or 4 courses at least.
She holds out her glass for a top off and carries on.
So tell me, Mr. Bingley, whom did you like least of all your guests this evening?
Really, this is enough.
Darcy looks down at Elizabeth from the staircase. He turns and walks away. Inside of the carriage, the Bennets are squeezed into their carriage. It is light outside. Only Mrs. Bennet is awake, but the lack of an audience does not stop her from talking.
Allowing for new carriages, dresses, etc., etc. We will be having a wedding here at Netherfield in less than 3 months. If you ask me, Mr. Bennet. Mr. Bennet!
Inside of the breakfast room at Longbourn, the Bennets eat in silence. Jane yawns. Mrs. Bennet moans. She is hungover. Mr. Collins comes in a state of agitation. They look at him. He sits, hesitates, then asks.
Mrs. Bennet, I was hoping, if it would not trouble you, that I might solicit a private audience with Miss Elizabeth in the course of the morning.
Oh,
you go.
Oh, yes, certainly. Lizzie would be very happy indeed. Please go ahead. No time like the present. Everyone out. Mr. Collins would like a private audience with your sister.
Wait, I beg you, Mr. Collins can have nothing to say to me that anybody need not hear.
No nonsense, Lizzie. I dare say you will stay where you are. Everyone else to the drawing room. Mr. Bennet?
But
Now!
Mrs. Bennet makes sure everyone leaves and then winks at Mr. Collins and shuts the door before Elizabeth has time to do anything. Elizabeth looks at Mr. Collins, who looks at her in earnest. There's a horrible pause of intense embarrassment.
Dear Miss Elizabeth, you can hardly doubt the purpose of my discourse. My intentions have been too marked to be mistaken. Almost as soon as I entered the house, I singled you out as the companion of my future life. But before I am run away with my feelings, perhaps I may state my reasons for marrying. Firstly, that is the duty of a clergyman to set the example of matrimony in his parish. Secondly, that I am convinced it will add greatly to my happiness. And thirdly, it is that the urging of my esteemed patroness, Lady Catherine, that I select a wife.
We hear a kick and Kitty screech from behind the door.
My object is coming to Longbourn was to choose such a one from amongst Mr. Bennet's daughters. For as you know, I am next in the entail of the state, and such an alliance will surely make amends for this. And now, nothing remains for me but to assure you in the most animated language of the violence of my affections.
Mr. Collins.
And that for no reproach on the subject of fortune will cross my lips once we are married.
You are too hasty, sir. You forget that I have made no answer.
I must add that Lady Catherine will thoroughly approve when I speak to her of your modesty, economy, and other amiable qualities.
Sir, I am honored by your proposal, but I regret I must decline it.
I know ladies have their pretty little ways and don't seek to seem too eager.
Mr. Collins, I am perfectly serious. You cannot make me happy, and I'm convinced I'm the last woman in the world who could make you happy.
I flatter myself, cousin, that your refusal is merely a natural delicacy. Besides, you should take into account that despite your manifold attractions, it is by no means certain that another offer of marriage may ever be made to you.
Mr. Collins.
So I must conclude that you simply seek to increase my love by suspense, according to the usual practice of elegant females.
Sir, I am not the sort of female to torment a respectable man. Please understand me. I cannot accept you.
Elizabeth storms out of the room and out of the house. Mrs. Bennet crashes in the door through the other, hot on the tail of Elizabeth.
Declined indeed, the headstrong, foolish child!
Thank you, but headstrong?
We shall have this little hiccup dealt with immediately, Mr. Collins.
Mrs. Bennet goes and chases after Elizabeth. Mr. Collins watches through the window as Elizabeth is chased by her mother. Inside the library at Longbourn, Mrs. Bennet marches in. Mr. Bennet looks up in shock.
Oh, Mr. Bennet, we are all in an uproar. You must come and make Lizzie marry Mr. Collins, for she vows she will not have him.
Mr. Bennet stares blankly at her.
Mr. Collins has proposed to Lizzie, but Lizzie declares she will not have him. And now the danger is Mr. Collins may not have Lizzie.
And what am I to do?
Mrs. Bennet drags him to his feet.
Speak to Lizzie.
They march to find Elizabeth. Inside of the hallway, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet confront Elizabeth, who has been waiting outside. Perhaps the other girls form an audience from the stairs. I guess they do. Mr. Collins looks on sheepishly from the breakfast room.
Tell her that you insist upon her marrying.
Papa, please.
You will have this house.
I can't marry him.
You'll save your sisters from destitution.
I can't.
Go back now and say you've changed your mind.
No.
Think of your family.
You can't make me.
Mr. Bennet, say something.
So your mother insists on you marrying Mr. Collins.
Yes, or I shall never see her again.
Well, Lizzie, from this day on, you must be a stranger to one of your parents.
Who will maintain you when your father is dead?
Your mother will never see you if you do not marry Mr. Collins, and I will never see you again if you do.
Mr. Bennet!
Thank you, Papa.
Elizabeth turns around and walks into the drawing room. She enters the drawing room and, wow, they say drawing room a lot in this one paragraph. Mary is trying to read through the family din. Jane sits very still. Her face is white. There's a letter in her hand. Mrs. Bennet charges in, Kitty and Lydia in tow, and speaks to anyone who will listen.
Oh, ungrateful child, I shall never speak to her again. Not that I have much pleasure in talking to anybody. People who suffer as I do from nervous complaints can have no inclination for talking. Nobody can tell what I suffer.
She jabbers on, but her voice fades. We're with Jane, rereading the letter.
What's wrong, Jane?
Close on Jane's pale face. She's staring at the letter.
But it is always so. Those who complain are never pitied.
At Netherfield, Bingley, Caroline, and Darcy sit grimly in a carriage which drives off. Inside of the carriage, Darcy looks severe and stern. Caroline can't help a little smirk on her face. Bingley looks back longingly. Inside of a bedroom at Longbourn, Elizabeth and Jane are in bed.
I don't understand. What would take him from Netherfield? Why would he not know when he was to return?
I have no reverse from you.
Jane passes Elizabeth the letter.
Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishment, so much so I must hope to hereafter call her my sister. It is my duty to indulge you in no hope in this respect for your own self.
Is that not clear enough?
Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you and has gone with him to persuade him otherwise.
But I know her to be incapable of willfully deceiving anyone.
He loves you, Jane. Do not give up. Go to our aunt in London and uncles in London. Let it be known you are there. I'm sure he will come to you.
Outside of Longbourn, Jane is in a carriage. Mrs. Bennet kisses her goodbye through the window as all the Bennets look on.
Give my love to my sister, and try not to be so much of a burden, dear.
Jane's carriage moves away and the family waves. Mr. Bennet talks to Elizabeth.
Poor Jane. However, a girl likes to be crossed in love now and then. Gives her something to think of and a sort of distinction among her companions.
I'm sure that will cheer her up, Papa.
It's your turn now, Lizzie. Since you've turned down Mr. Collins, you're free to go off and be jilted yourself. What about Mr. Wickham? He's a pleasant fellow and would do the job creditably.
Thank you, but less agreeable man would satisfy me. We must not all expect Jane's good fortune.
Still, it's a comfort to know that whatever might befall you, you have an affectionate mother who will be sure to make the most of it.
Inside of the bedroom, Elizabeth is making the bed and tidying Jane's belongings. There's a knock at the door and Charlotte enters. My dear Elizabeth, I've come here to tell you the news.
What news?
Mr. Collins and I are engaged to be married.
Engaged?
You don't mind, do you?
No. Of course not.
He asked for my hand this morning, and I accepted him. I can see you're surprised, coming so soon after his wishing to marry you.
No.
I'm not a romantic, you know, and I only ask a comfortable home, and considering Mr. Collins' character and situation in life, I'm convinced my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can hope for.
And that's all you expect?
For women in our situation, what choice is there?
Don't speak like that, Charlotte.
To become an old maid, at best tolerated, at worst a burden, dependent on the kindness of others, or seek the protection of marriage.
And we only have two choices?
Yes. Elizabeth gazes at her closest friend. Charlotte has recovered herself. She now looks cool and composed, unnervingly so.
You can still change your mind, Charlotte.
I'm 27 years old. Oh my god, she's so young. We hear the sound of militia drums. Outside Meryton, the militia are leaving. Hundreds of soldiers and officers in red coats marching out of the village to the sound of pipes and drums. The villagers are out to bid them farewell. Lydia and Kitty run through the crowds very distraught. They find Elizabeth coming in the other direction.
It's too dreadful. They're leaving for Brighton.
All of them? Kitty?
They got called this morning.
Not a word of warning.
Lydia wails. Elizabeth searches the redcoats for Wickham. She spots him. He glances across at her. She gives him a pathetic wave and he's gone. Lydia and Kitty chase the last of the officers, leaving Elizabeth alone. She walks into the post office. Inside of the post office, the postmaster hands a letter to Elizabeth. She opens it and reads it.
Bad news, miss?
It could not be worse. I have been invited to possibly the very last place on earth I would like to go.
Outside of Merrington, Elizabeth comes out of the post office to reveal time has passed. The now deserted village is covered in a thick blanket of snow. A lonely Elizabeth walks totally despondent.
All right, we're back on.
All right. So outside of Hunsford Parsonage in Kent, Charlotte's new home is a smallish but charming restory in Kent. Charlotte greets Elizabeth, kissing her warmly. Mr. Collins bows as he ushers her in.
Welcome to our humble abode.
There's a coop containing hens of various description, a pigsty, a vegetable patch, a rose bower. Charlotte and Mr. Collins are showing Elizabeth around the place.
And from here, we have a good view of Rosings Park, where we are honored to dine at least twice a week. Her ladyship's carriage is regularly ordered for us. I should say one of her ladyship's carriages, for she has several.
My dear, I think our guest is tired after her journey. Come on, Elizabeth. Come on, Lizzie. Let's get some tea.
My wife encourages me to spend as much time in the garden as possible for the sake of my health. I plan my improvements, of course. I intend to throw out a bow there and plant a lime walk. Oh yes, I flatter myself that any young lady would be happy to be the mistress of such a house.
A tiny nod from Elizabeth. She understands perfectly. Inside of Charlotte's parlor, Lizzie and Charlotte are at last alone. They sit down with a certain relief in a charming little parlor that faces the front of the house. Charlotte pours out tea. We shall not be disturbed here, for this parlor is for my own particular use. Oh, Lizzie, it's such a pleasure to run my own house.
Charlotte, come here!
Charlotte jumps up and rushes to the window.
What's happened?
Charlotte!
Has the pig escaped?
Lizzie joins her at the window. Outside in the lane, Mr. Collins stands bowing at a carriage. It's all right, it's just Lady Catherine. I don't know what that accent was. They burst out laughing for, okay.
Yeah, for just a moment.
Tell me, how are things concerning Mr. Wickham?
I have not heard from Mr. Wickham since the regiment left for Brighton, but I am informed by Lydia, who keeps abreast of all matters military, that he does very well.
Oh, Lizzie. We hear Mr. Collins rushing back into the house and running up the stairs.
Great news! Great news! We have an invitation to visit Rosings this evening from Lady Catherine de Bourgh.
Elizabeth is not overcome with enthusiasm.
Do not make yourself uneasy, my dear cousin, about your apparel. Just put on that which is best among your clothes, and Lady Catherine will not think the worse of it.
Outside the grounds of Rosing, Elizabeth, Charlotte, and Mr. Collins walk hurriedly across the lawns towards the great house. Beyond the topiaried hedges, and the gray building looms ominously above them. It is grand without being elegant.
One of the most extraordinary sights in all of Europe, is it not? The gazing alone cost upwards of £20,000.
Inside the stairway, Mr. Collins, Charlotte, and Elizabeth are led up the vast stairway, which is painted with visions of hell. Elizabeth stops in front of a painting of a devil. She stares at it. It seems to speak, but she realizes the voice is Collins chiding her.
This way.
The salon at Rosings is spectacularly grand, hideously so. Heavy furniture, rows of servants. The three guests are shown in by the footman. Again, Mr. Collins scrapes the floor with his bow.
Your ladyship, Mr. Board.
The Lady Catherine is a haughty, bossy woman. Pretty unspeakable, really. Her daughter is a sickly, irritable-looking creature.
So, you are Elizabeth Bennet.
I am, your ladyship.
This is my daughter.
It's very kind of you to ask us to dine, Lady Catherine.
The chimney piece alone cost £400.
But Lizzie doesn't hear. Darcy walks into the room. Lizzie freezes. When he sees Lizzie, he too falters and recovers himself. Another man, Fitzwilliam, is with him.
Mr. Darcy, what are you doing here?
Mr. Darcy, I had no idea we would have the honor.
A stiff bow from Darcy, who looks at Mr. Collins as if he's something brought in by the dog. He turns to Lizzie, trying to collect himself.
Miss Bennet, I'm staying here.
You know my nephew?
Yes, madam. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Hertfordshire.
Darcy's friend, Fitzwilliam, is a much more easygoing chap, introduces himself.
Colonel Fitzwilliam, how do you do?
He bows. Lizzie returns the smile gratefully. They move towards the dining room. Mr. Collins leans towards Lizzie.
You know, Mr. Darcy is good as engaged to Mr.
Really? Miss Bingley will be disappointed to hear that. What a sickly, cross little thing. Oh, yes, they should suit each other very well.
Charlotte smiles back, a little fearfully. She's more intimidated by Rosings than Elizabeth is, and indeed has more at stake. The dining room is laid for a very grand dinner, footmen waiting, thousands of candles. Lady Catherine seats herself at the head of the table. The guests wait for their orders.
You sit there, and you sit there. Mr. Collins, you can't sit next to your wife.
After some awkward shuffling around, they all sit down. Lizzie, much to her discomfort, finds herself sitting next to Darcy. There's a pause.
I trust your family is in good health, Miss Bennet?
They are, thank you. My eldest sister is currently in London. Perhaps you happen to see her there?
I haven't been fortunate enough, no.
Lizzie looks at him. He colors slightly. Lady Catherine addresses Lizzie in a loud voice from the head of the table.
Do you play the pianoforte, Miss Bennet?
A little, ma'am, and very poorly.
Oh, do you draw?
No, not at all.
Your sisters, do they draw?
Not one.
That is very strange. But I suppose you had no opportunity. Your mother...
Miss Bennet, I believe you froze.
I did freeze, sorry.
Like, are you frozen or am I frozen?
Everybody. My mother would have no objection, but my father hates town.
Has your governess left you?
We never had a governess.
Mr. Collins squirms in embarrassment. Darcy watches Elizabeth keenly.
No governess? 5 daughters brought up at home without a governess. I never heard of such a thing. Your mother must have been quite a slave to your education.
Not at all, Lady Catherine.
Are any of your younger sisters out?
Yes, ma'am. All.
All? What, 5 out at once? Very odd. And you only the second. The younger ones out before the elders are married. Your younger sisters must be very young.
Yes, my youngest is not yet 16, but I think it would be very hard on younger sisters not to have their share of amusement because the elders still are married. And to be best kept back on such a motive, it would hardly encourage sisterly affection.
Upon my word, you give your opinion very decidedly for so young a person. Pray, what is your age?
With 3 young sisters grown up, your ladyship can hardly expect me to own it.
Lady Catherine looks astonished. Mr. Collins shifts in his seat. Mr. Darcy glances sharply, in fact, admiringly, at Lizzie. She's enjoying herself. Dinner is over, and they are drinking coffee. Darcy moves toward Elizabeth, but Lady Catherine interrupts by shouting from her seat.
Come, Miss Bennet, and play for us.
No, I beg you.
For music is my delight. In fact, there are few people in England who have more true enjoyment of music than myself, or better natural taste. If I had ever learnt, I should have been a great proficient. And so would Anne, if her health would have allowed her.
Please, I told you I play poorly.
Come, Elizabeth, her ladyship demands it.
Lizzie reluctantly sits down at the piano and starts to play. Lady Catherine takes no notice and talks loudly over the music.
How does Georgiana get along, Darcy?
She plays very well.
I hope she practices. No excellence can be acquired without constant practice. I have told Mrs. Collins this. Though you have no instrument of your own, you are very welcome to come to Rosings and play the piano on the housekeeper's room.
Thank you, your ladyship.
You would be in nobody's way, you know, in that part of the house.
Darcy flinches at her bad manners. He moves away to the piano where Lizzie is playing. Not that terribly well, it must be said. A moment passes.
You mean to frighten me, Mr. Darcy, by coming in all your state to hear me, but I won't be alarmed, even though your sister does play so well.
I am well enough acquainted with you, Miss Bennet, to know I cannot alarm you, even should I wish it.
Beat. They eye each other warily. Colonel Fitzgerald joins them.
What was my friend like in Hertfordshire?
You really care to know? Prepare for yourself for something very dreadful. The first time I saw him, at the assembly, he danced with nobody at all. Even though gentlemen were scarce, and there was more than one young lady who was sitting down without a partner.
I knew nobody beyond my own party.
True, and nobody can be introduced in a ballroom.
Fitzwilliam, come here and talk to us.
Fitzwilliam moves away. Darcy and Elizabeth are alone.
I do not have a talent of conversing easily with people I have never met before.
Maybe you should take your aunt's advice and practice.
Ouch. Darcy flinches. Lizzie turns away from him and carries on playing. Darcy gazes at the curve of her neck. She plays a false note, stumbles, and grimly carries on. Elizabeth is writing a letter in the drawing room. She starts, "Dear Jane." The doorbell rings in the background. She thinks nothing of it and continues. The maid opens the door to the drawing room and Mr. Darcy enters.
Mr. Darcy, please do be seated. I'm afraid Mr. and Mrs. Collins are gone to business in the village.
A pause. What on earth does Mr. Darcy want? He paces up and down.
This is a charming house. I believe my aunt did a great deal to it when Mr. Collins first arrived.
I believe so, and she could not have bestowed her kindness on more of a grateful subject.
Mr. Collins seems very fortunate in his choice of wife.
He is indeed lucky to have found one of the few sensible women who could have accepted him. Shall I call for some tea?
No, thank you.
The sound of the front door and voices. Darcy jumps up.
Good day, Miss Bennet. It's been a pleasure.
He bows to her and leaves. Elizabeth sits there, bemused and intrigued. Cut to Charlotte, in the hallway, taking off her bonnet. Darcy hurries past her with a swift bow and leaves abruptly. Charlotte gazes after him in surprise. Charlotte heads to the drawing room where she finds Elizabeth sitting bemused. What on earth have you done to poor Mr. Darcy?
I have no idea.
She truly doesn't. Charlotte gives Elizabeth a look. Outside the Hunsford Church. Sunday service is over and the worshippers are leaving the church. Mr. Collins, in his vestments, obeses himself Okay. To Lady Catherine, who is sweeping out with her miserable-looking daughter and downtrodden governess. Elizabeth joins Colonel Fitzwilliam. They walk down the path together.
How long do you plan to stay in Kent, Colonel?
As long as Darcy chooses, I am at his disposal.
I do imagine your cousin brought you down with him chiefly to have someone to order around. I wonder he does not marry and secure the lasting convenience of that kind.
She would be a lucky woman.
Really?
Darcy is a most loyal companion from what I heard. On our journey here, he recently came to the rescue of one of his friends just in time.
Darcy, waylaid by various people, comes out of the church. His eyes search for Elizabeth. He sees her with Fitzwilliam and hesitates. Too late. Mr. Collins steps up to stop him and engages him in conversation. Elizabeth stops at the churchyard gate.
What happened?
He saved the man from an imprudent marriage.
Who was the man?
His closest friend, Mr. Bringley.
Did Darcy give you his reasons for this interference?
There was apparently strong objections to the lady.
What kind of objections? Her lack of fortune?
I think it was her family that was considered unsuitable.
So he separated them.
I believe so. I know nothing else.
Elizabeth grows pale. She turns to look at Darcy, who is joined by his aunt.
I wish Mr. Darcy and all his friends well in finding partners suitable to their very high standards. Good morning, Colonel Fitzwilliam.
Elizabeth sees that this doesn't make grammatical sense, are still busy with their parishioners and slips away. Darcy sees her from a distance. Outside of Rosings Park, Lizzie walks across the park anywhere. She hardly cares. She's in a turmoil of misery and fury. How could Darcy do such a terrible thing? It starts to rain. Cut to a Grecian summer house by the lake. The rain is now bucketing down. Lizzie hurries into the summer house and sits down heavily on a bench. Her poor sister. Lizzie gazes in despair at the rain-lashed landscape. A man approaches across the park. He draws near. It's Darcy! Elizabeth stiffens. He's hurrying towards her. Sodden, breathless, he comes into the summer house. He is in a state of agitation, far too agitated to notice her upset face.
Miss Bennet, I have struggled in vain, but I cannot bear it any longer. The past months have been a torment. I came to Rosings with the single object of seeing you. I had to see you.
Me?
I fought against my better judgment, my family's expectation, the inferiority of your birth, my rank and circumstance, all these things. But I'm willing to put them aside and ask you to end my agony.
I don't understand.
I love you, most ardently. Please do me the honor of accepting my hand.
Sir, I appreciate the struggle you've been through, and I am very sorry to have caused you pain. Believe me, it was unconsciously done.
Is this your reply?
Yes, sir.
You're laughing at me.
No!
You're rejecting me.
I am sure the feelings which, as you've told me, have hindered your regard will help you in overcoming it.
Terrible silence as this sinks in. Neither of them can move. At last, Darcy speaks. He's very pale.
I might ask why, with so little endeavor at civility, I am thus repulsed?
I might as well inquire why was so evident a design of insulting me. You choose to tell me that you liked me against your better judgment. If I was uncivil, that was some excuse.
Believe me, I didn't mean...
But I have other reasons, you know I have.
What reasons?
Do you think anything that might tempt me to accept a man who has ruined, perhaps forever, the happiness of my most beloved sister? Do you deny it, Mr. Darcy, that you separated a young couple who loved each other, exposing your friend to the censure of the world for caprice, and my sister to its derision for disappointed hopes, and involving them in both misery of the acutest kind?
I do not deny.
How could you do it?
Because I believed your sister indifferent to him.
Indifferent?
I watched them most carefully and realized his attachment was much deeper than hers.
That's because she's shy.
Bingley, too, is modest and was persuaded that she didn't feel strongly for him.
Because you suggested it.
I did it for his own good.
My sister hardly shows her true feelings to me. I suppose you suspect that his fortune had become some bearing on the matter.
No, I wouldn't do your sister any dishonor, though it was suggested.
What was?
It was made perfectly clear that an advantageous marriage...
Did my sister give that impression?
No. There was, however, I have to admit, the matter of your family.
Our want of connection. Mr. Bingley didn't vex himself about that.
No, it was more than that.
How, sir?
It pains me to say this, but it was the lack of propriety shown by your mother. Your three younger sisters, even on occasion, your father. Please forgive me. You and your sister, I must exclude from this.
And what about Mr. Wickham?
Mr. Wickham,
What excuse can you give for your behavior to him?
you take an eager interest in that gentleman's concerns?
He told me of his misfortunes.
Oh, yes. His misfortunes have been very great indeed.
You have ruined his chances and yet treat him with sarcasm?
So this is your opinion of me. Thank you for explaining so fully. Perhaps these offenses might have been overlooked if your pride had not been hurt.
My pride?
By my honesty in admitting scruples about our relationship. Could you expect me to rejoice in the inferiority of your circumstances?
And those are the words of a gentleman. From the first moment I met you, your arrogance and conceit, your selfish disdain, and the feelings of others made me realize that you were the last man in the world I could ever be prevailed upon to marry.
Forgive me, madam, for taking up so much of your time.
He leaves abruptly. Elizabeth watches him stride away through the rain. What has she done? She bitterly bursts into tears. At Hunsford, Elizabeth comes in soaked to the skin. Charlotte runs to her. Elizabeth!
I was caught somewhat off guard.
Inside their bedroom, Charlotte attends to Elizabeth, who is changed and is drying her hair, a shawl around her shoulder. Shall I call the doctor?
No, Charlotte. I should be quite all right. Please give Lady de Bourgh my apologies. You must not keep her waiting.
Mr. Collins clatters up the stairs.
Come on, we shall be late.
Charlotte leaves reluctantly and goes downstairs. Later, the sound of the front door closing. Elizabeth sits down heavily on the bed. She walks downstairs and enters the drawing room. Elizabeth, is in the drawing room. She looks at a book on the table. It is Fordyce's Sermons. She puts it down and walks to the mirror and stares at herself. After a moment, suddenly Darcy's face appears. She freezes. They stare at each other without speaking. Finally,
Came to leave you this.
he places a letter on the table behind her. Elizabeth does not turn but watches him in the mirror.
I'm not going to renew the sentiments which were so disgusting to you, but to address the two offenses you have laid against me. I had not long been in Hertfordshire before I saw that Bingley preferred your eldest sister. I observed my friend's behaviour attentively, and I could perceive that his partiality for Miss Bennet was beyond what I have ever witnessed in him. Yet, when I observed your sister, I detected no symptom of peculiar regard, and witnessed only the family's coarse appetite for having their daughters married favourably. And so in London, perhaps erroneously, I persuaded him of the unfitness of the match, citing your sister's coolness towards him. It was unknowingly done, and though the motives which governed me may to you appear naturally insufficient, they were done to protect a friend. And to the other more serious matter.
As Elizabeth turns, she realizes Darcy is gone. Darcy's voice carries.
My father's provided for Mr. Wickham a valuable living.
Elizabeth tears open the envelope, her hand shaking, and reads the letter as Darcy's voice carries on.
But upon his death, however, Mr. Wickham told me that he had no intention of taking orders, and would I recompense him to the tune of £3,000, so he could go to town and study the law. This I did, though by now I had some doubts about his character. These were confirmed by my reports that he had sunk into a life of idleness, gambling, and dissipation. The money was soon used up, whereupon he wrote demanding more money, which I refused, whereupon he severed all acquaintances.
Holding the letter, she looks out the window to see Darcy riding away.
Last summer, he was unwillingly obtruded by my notices when he convened a relationship with my sister, whom he persuaded to be in love with him and made her consent to an elopement. She was but 15.
Outside of Hunsford, Darcy rides off.
Mr. Wickham's prime objective was her inheritance of £30,000, but hope of revenging me was a strong inducement. I was lucky enough to persuade my sister of her folly. I hope this goes some way to mitigating my behavior in your eyes. If you doubt my word, please have it confirmed by my cousin Fitzwilliam.
Inside the drawing room, Elizabeth with the letter. Charlotte walks in. Elizabeth is shaking. Lizzie, are you all right?
I do not know. I hardly know myself.
Cut to Elizabeth riding in a carriage through Cheapside, reading the letter.
Yes, so we shall never meet again. I wish you all the happiness in the future.
Elizabeth looks out at the high warehouse building and the bustle of trade. There is no horizon. Inside the gardener's house in Cheapside, Mrs. Gardiner, the girl's kindly aunt, is taking Elizabeth's coat off from her.
Sorry. How fortunate you are here, just in time to catch everyone coming through from Longbourn.
How is Jane?
She is outside.
Through a window, Elizabeth sees Jane sitting quietly alone at her needlework. Cut to a small back garden of the gardener's house. Elizabeth and Jane sit together. Jane is all smiles, but behind her eyes is a sadness unseen before. Elizabeth is desperate to unburden herself, but feels unable.
I am quite over him, Lizzie. If he passed in the street, I would hardly notice. London is so diverting.
Oh, Jane.
It's true. What with the theatre and... But tell me, what news from Kent?
Nothing. Everything is as you might imagine.
Elizabeth tries to smile. There's a crash as all the Bennets arrive at the house. Kitty rushes into the garden crying her eyes out as she's followed by Lydia and Mrs. Bennet.
Lizzie, tell Mama, tell her.
Mrs. Forster has invited me.
Why did she ask me as well?
Kitty, what's happened?
Because she likes me better.
I've just as much right as Lydia.
Oh, if I could but go to Brighton.
And more so because I'm 2 years older.
Lydia has been invited to Brighton with the Forsters.
A little sea bathing would set me up very nicely.
I shall dine with the officers every night.
I'm sure I cried for 2 days when Colonel Miller's regiment went away. I thought I should have a broken heart.
Mother, are you mad?
Inside the gardener's house, Elizabeth has found a quiet corner with her father.
Please, Papa, don't let her go.
Lydia will never be easy till she has exposed herself in some public place or other, and we can never expect her to do it with so little inconvenience as under the present circumstances.
If you, dear father, will not take the trouble to check her, she will be fixed forever as the silliest and most determined flirt who ever made her family ridiculous. And Kitty will follow as she always does.
We shall have no peace until she goes.
Peace? Is that all you care about?
Colonel Foster is a sensible man and will keep her out of any real mischief, and she is far too poor to be an object of prey to anyone.
Father, it's dangerous.
I'm sure the officers will find women better worth their while. Let's hope, in fact, that her stay in Brighton will teach her her own insignificance. At any rate, she can hardly grow any worse without authorizing us to lock her up for the rest of her life.
Elizabeth gazes at her father. Will nothing touch him? He gave up on his daughter long ago. For this, just now, she hates him.
No wonder our family is treated with contempt.
She leaves, tears stinging her eyes. Her father looks puzzled at her outburst. Inside the drawing room, Mr. Bennet follows Elizabeth in.
Well, at least the house will be quieter.
I don't wish to be stuck with such a foolish family any longer. With your consent, with your constant talk of men and marriages, surely there's more to life.
Lizzie, dear, you would be very welcome to accompany us.
Oh, yes. My plan to journey through Peak District, you'd be most welcome.
Oh, the glories of nature. What are men compared to rocks and mountains?
Believe me, men are either eaten up with arrogance or stupidity, and if they're amiable, they're so easily led to that have no minds of their own whatsoever.
Take care, my love. The Saviour strongly of bitterness.
No, they bring nothing but heartache.
Inside the bedroom at Cheapside, as usual, Jane and Elizabeth share a bed. They lie next to each other in the darkness.
I saw Mr. Darcy when I was in Rosings.
Why did you not tell me? Did he mention Mr. Bingley?
No, he did not.
Elizabeth has never felt more alone in the company of her sister. Outside of Derbyshire, a ravishing landscape of savage and romantic beauty. Scudding clouds, mountains, wild rocky outcrops. Elizabeth is walking freely, the wind in her hair. As she nears the peak of a promontory, Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner are making their way towards her. They smile at her. She strides off, determined to reach the very top. When she gets there, she stands with her arms outstretched, her head back, laughing into the wind. The view is magnificent. She breathes deeply. Outside of Lambton, at dusk, an establishing shot of Lambton, a charming market town. Through the window of an inn, we see Elizabeth and Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner at a table. Inside the inn, the Gardiners and Elizabeth are eating supper. An air of high spirits. At the next table, another amiable tourist couple are also tucking into their food. Ew.
He's been taking the waters at Buxton. Hasn't done him a lot of good.
We've had a fine time, haven't we, dear?
We've visited Chatsworth, Dovedale, Pemberley.
Pemberley?
Just 2 miles from here.
One of the best houses in the country.
Aren't you acquainted with the owner, Mr. Darcy?
Well, we shall go there tomorrow, Lizzie.
I would rather stay here.
Stay here?
I must own that I'm tired of great houses, all those carpets and curtains.
But you liked Chatsworth.
If it is anything like Mr. Darcy, I am sure I will not be able to bear it.
Come, Lizzie.
The grounds alone are worth the visit.
Let us not make a fuss. If the girl does not want to go there, it is little point persuading her.
Inside the bedroom in the inn, Lizzie's preparing for bed. The chambermaid fills her wash bowl and starts to leave.
I hear the Pemberley is not far from here. Karina?
Sorry.
I hear the Pemberley is not far from here.
Yes, madam.
You see something of the owner, do you, in town?
Not for some months, madam. For he's still in London, I believe.
Outside of Pemberley, the carriage enters the gates.
I'm so glad you changed your mind.
Elizabeth is alert, her eyes bright with curiosity. The parkland is wild and rocky. Deer graze, rooks wheel in the sky. I guess that's birds. A sense of freedom and liberation. As the carriage drives over the top of a hill, close on Elizabeth's face, she gasps. The Gardiners gasp. A huge wide shot of Pemberley House. Its vast, breathtaking, beautiful, set in a great boulder-strewn parklands. A mansion built of golden stone glowing in the sunlight. Outside in the park, Elizabeth walks through the magnificent grounds.
Imagine being mistress of all this. It is as big as old Cheapside.
Inside of Pemberley, Elizabeth and the Gardners are being taken on a tour by the housekeeper, Mrs. Reynolds, who whitters on in the background with descriptions of each room. Elizabeth is apart, and we witness the exquisite house from her point of view. A book lies open on a reading desk. Elizabeth turns over and reads the title.
Keep up.
They walk through room after amazing room, a breathtaking library, and unbelievable staircase. Inside the picture gallery, Elizabeth is apart from the rest, looking at pictures. She stops by a painting of Darcy. She looks at it thoughtfully, but is interrupted by Mrs. Reynolds and the Gardners, who are following her.
This is my master, Mr. Darcy.
A handsome face. Lizzie, is it a true likeness of him?
Does this young lady know Mr. Darcy?
Only a little.
And do you not think him a handsome man, miss?
Yes. Yes, I suppose he is.
Mrs. Reynolds moves the Gardners on to another painting, but Elizabeth stays staring at Darcy's image.
And this is his sister, Miss Georgina. She plays and sings all day long.
We realize that in the distance we have heard music. Elizabeth is still gazing at the portrait of Darcy, then suddenly snaps out of her reverie as she processes Mrs. Reynolds' speech.
They're at home.
Miss Darcy is always down for the summer. Mr. Darcy is due here tomorrow.
Is your master much at Pemberley?
Not much as I would wish, sir, for he dearly loves it here.
Relaxed again, Elizabeth wanders off as the Gardners talk to Mrs. Reynolds.
If he should marry, you might see more of him.
Yes, madam, but I do not know when that will be. I do not know a lady who is good enough for him.
What do you mean?
I've known Mr. Darcy since he was a boy. He was always a kind and generous person. Even then, not everyone can see it, because he does not make a meal of it, like a lot of young men nowadays, but he is the most sweet-tempered and kind-hearted man I have ever known.
As the Gardners look at more paintings, Elizabeth drifts out through the open doors and onto a terrace. In the bright sunlight, the view of the gardens and valley beyond is exquisite. Outside, the music we heard before is louder. Elizabeth wanders aimlessly across the terrace, being unconsciously drawn by the music. Suddenly, Elizabeth recognizes the tune. Perhaps it's one that she has played earlier, but this time is being played exquisitely. She follows the music round a corner, intrigued as she gets closer and closer to its source. She finally realizes that she's outside the room where the music is being played. She steels herself a moment, but her curiosity gets the better of her, and she discreetly peeps in. Through the window, she sees Georgina Darcy, a beautiful 15-year-old playing the piano with great passion and fluency. She's moved by the music and listens. After some time, then steps into her view, but is mostly hidden by shadows in the room. She is directly behind Georgina and gently puts her hands over her eyes. Georgina stops playing and laughs uproariously. She stands and kisses the figure. The sunlight hits his face. It is Darcy. Georgina and Darcy kiss. Elizabeth is stunned to see him there. Darcy glances up and sees Elizabeth watching him. For a moment, they both stare at each other, frozen with surprise. Georgina stares in fright at the figure. Elizabeth turns and runs. Darcy comes up after her.
Miss Bennet.
Elizabeth stops, appallingly embarrassed. Darcy catches up with her. They both blush deeply.
I thought you were in London.
No, I'm not.
No.
I came here a day early. Some business with my...
I'm so terribly sorry. I'm visiting Derbyshire with my aunt and uncle.
And are you having a pleasant trip?
Very pleasant. Tomorrow we go to Matlock.
Tomorrow? Are you staying at Lambton?
Yes, at the Rose and Crown. I'm so sorry to intrude. They said the house was open for visitors. I had no idea.
May I see you to the village?
Oh, no. I'm very fond of walking.
Yes.
Bye, Mr. Darcy.
She hurries away. He gazes after her. Cut to a wood. Now that she's out of sight, Lizzie collapses on a log. She's utterly undone. Around her, the birds sing. Inside of the inn, it is night. Lizzie comes downstairs for supper and stops. Through a gap in the door to the restaurant, she sees Mr. Darcy talking to her aunt and uncle.
I shall send my carriage at noon.
After a moment, Darcy leaves and Elizabeth approaches the table.
Lizzie, I've just met Mr. Darcy. Why didn't you tell us you had seen him? He's asked us to dine with him tomorrow. He was very civil, was he not?
Very civil.
Not at all like you painted him.
To dine with him.
There is something pleasing about his mouth when he speaks.
You don't mind delaying our journey another day?
He particularly wishes you to meet his sister.
His sister?
Inside the library and drawing room at Pemberley, a footman escorts Elizabeth and the Gardiners through the stupendous library. From the drawing room, the sound of a piano is playing. It's the same music Elizabeth played at Rosings, but this time it's played very beautifully. Elizabeth is filled with trepidation. We can almost feel her heart racing. The footman opens the double doors to reveal the magnificent drawing room. Darcy is there. So is the dreaded Mr. Bingley, or Miss Bingley. Seeing her, Elizabeth's polite smile falters. Darcy's sister Georgina plays the piano. She jumps up and hurries over.
My sister, Miss Darcy.
Miss Elizabeth, my brother has told me so much about you. I feel as if we're friends already.
What a beautiful instrument.
My brother gave it to me. He shouldn't have.
Yes, I should.
Very well done.
She's easily persuaded, is she not?
Miss Bingley approaches.
What a surprise, Miss Bennet, to see you at Devonshire.
Your brother is well, I trust.
Very well. He hopes to come here soon. Pemberley has a special attraction for him.
Yes, the library is particularly splendid, is it not?
And how is your family, Miss Bennet? Someone told me the militia are removed from Meryton. They must be a great loss for some of you.
Your uncle is fond of fishing, I hear.
Yes, very.
Can you persuade him to borrow a rod this afternoon? For the lake here is very well stocked, and its occupants left in peace for far too long.
Elizabeth smiles, surprised and delighted, and grateful to be rescued. What does Darcy mean by this? She moves away to speak to her uncle. Miss Bingley moves closer to Darcy.
In 6 months, I have never seen anyone so altered. How brown and coarse she has become.
I perceive no alteration, except she is rather tanned. Hardly a miraculous consequence of traveling in the summer.
I remember when we first knew her in Hertfordshire. You said she's a beauty. I would have as soon called her mother a wit.
You must have misheard, Caroline. Even had I thought it, I would have couched it with a little more finesse.
Elizabeth looks across at Darcy. They smile at each other. Outside of Derbyshire at dusk, Darcy is driving Elizabeth and the Gardiners back to Lambton. The rugged landscape looks even more beautiful and dramatic in dusk than in light. Elizabeth sits up with Darcy, who holds the reins, while Mr. and Mrs. Gardiner sit comfortably in the carriage. Mr. Gardiner smiles broadly at the 2 large fish that lie beside him.
It is so beautiful up here. I will be sorry to leave. You have a most gracious host. I'm sure my aunt and uncle will talk of nothing else for days.
I've recently thought a great deal about how I appear and act to others.
It does you credit, sir.
Inside the inn at Lambton, the party arrives back.
Uh, yes. What a capital fellow.
Thank you so much, Mr. Darcy.
Darcy is about to take his leave when a servant brings Elizabeth a letter.
For you, madam.
It's from Jane.
She rips open the letter. Inside of the parlor in the inn, Elizabeth is crying with the open letter in her hand. Darcy and Mr. and Mrs. Gardner stand dumb, not quite knowing what to do. Elizabeth tries to speak but bursts into tears again. She cries for a long time.
Miss Elizabeth. Elizabeth.
It's the most dreadful news. Lydia's run away with Mr. Wickham. They're gone together from Brighton and Lord knows where. She has no connections. Fear she is lost forever.
This is my fault. Only I had exposed Wickham when I should.
Oh, this is my fault. I might have prevented it all from merely being open with my sisters rather than too proud with my knowledge.
Has anything been done to recover her?
Father has gone to London, but I know very well that nothing can be done. We have not the smallest of hope.
To heaven that anything could be said or done on my part could offer consolation to such distress.
So I think it is too late.
I'm afraid we must go at once. We'll join Mr. Bennet and find Lydia before she ruins the family forever.
I'm so very sorry. This is so grave indeed. I will leave you. Goodbye.
Darcy pauses at the door, looks back at Elizabeth, and then is gone. Outside in the countryside, the gardener's carriage rushes through the night. Inside at Longbourn, in Mrs. Bennet's bedroom, Elizabeth, Jane, Mary, and Kitty are gathered around Mrs. Bennet, who has taken to her bed.
Why did the Fosters let her out of their sight? I always said they were unfit to have charge of her.
Now she's ruined.
You're all ruined. Who will take you now with a fallen sister? Poor Mr. Bennet will now have to fight versus William and then be killed.
He hasn't found him yet, Mama.
And the Collins will turn us out before he is cold in his grave.
Do not be alarmed, Mamma. Our uncle is helping in the search.
Lydia must have known what this will do to my nerves, such flusterings and spasms all over me.
Outside in London, we're looking directly down at a London street. Mr. Bennet stands still against the passing pedestrian traffic. He tries to address a passerby.
Excuse me. Excuse me, I'm looking for...
Mr. Bennet takes out a piece of paper. Inside a mess hall in the barracks, Mr. Bennet walks timidly into the mess hall. It is smoky, drunken, noisy, boisterous, and extremely threatening. Mr. Bennet stops at the threshold, gulps, and takes then the whole room turns around to look at him, and a sudden silence descends. Mr. Bennet is terrified.
I am looking for Mr. Wickham.
Inside, upstairs at Longbourn, Elizabeth and Jane are outside Mrs. Bennet's room. From inside, we hear a moan.
We are ruined. Ruined.
How long is this going to go on for?
Don't be too harsh. This is hard for all of us.
They walk downstairs, and then into the drawing room. Kitty and Mary are busying themselves.
I can't bear not hearing anything.
Look, it's Papa.
Inside the library, the girls rush in. Mr. Bennet slumps into his desk.
Who is to fight Wickham to make him marry Lydia now that you've come home?
For God's sake, let me be. Lizzie, help me with my boots.
Elizabeth pulls off his boots for him.
You suppose them to be still in London?
Or else could they be so well concealed?
Oh, Father, I'm so sorry.
It's been my own doing.
You mustn't be You mustn't be too severe on yourself.
No, Lizzie. Let me once in my life feel how much I have been to blame. I am not afraid of being overpowered by the experience. It will pass away soon enough.
Inside a boarding house in London. We're looking through a window to the stairwell of a seedy-looking boarding house. An anonymous pair of men's boots appear climbing up the stairs. We move across the exterior wall of the building to find an open window through which Lydia and Wickham can be seen. Lydia and Wickham sit, snuggled close beside the fire in their room in a humble lodging house. They're eating a meal with relish. Giggling, Lydia feeds him a mouthful. A knock at the door. They freeze like naughty children. Outside in the garden at Longbourn, the girls have a letter. Kitty grabs it from Jane. Mary grabs it from Kitty. Before she has the chance to open it, Jane grabs it from Mary.
It's to Daddy. It's an uncle's writing.
Mr. Bennet snatches the letter.
As it is addressed to me.
He tears it open and begins to read, squinting because he's forgotten his glasses.
Found him.
Are they married?
Just wait. I can't make out his script.
Give it to me.
Snatches it. Oh.
Give it to me.
Are they married?
They will be. If father settles £100 a year on her, that is Wickham's condition.
£100?
You will agree to this, father?
The letter's passed around to the other girls.
Of course I will agree, but how much your uncle has laid on this wretched man already is anybody's guess.
What do you mean, father?
No man in his senses would marry Lydia on so slight a temptation as 100 a year.
Ah, I see.
See what?
Your uncle is very generous.
Do you think it a large sum?
Wickman's a fool if he takes her for less than 10,000 pounds. I should be sorry to think so ill of him in the very beginning of our relationship.
10,000? Heaven forbid!
Inside Mr. and Mrs. Bennet's bedroom. Close on Mrs. Bennet's face as she springs out of bed. Pure triumphant joy.
Lydia married, and it's 16 too. Ring the bell, Kitty. I must put on my things and tell Lady Lucas. Oh, to see her face and tell the servants they will have a bowl of punch.
The other Bennets are assembled.
We should thank our uncle, Mama.
And so he should help. He's much richer than us, and he hasn't got any children.
How can you talk like that?
A daughter married.
Is that all you think about?
Mrs. Wickham, how well it sounds.
You don't know what he's like.
Now, where will they live? Purvis Lodge might do. Ashworth is vacant, of course, but it's too far off. I couldn't bear to have her 10 miles from me.
Before you take any of these houses, Mrs. Bennet, let us be clear. Into one house she will never be welcome.
Inside the the hallway, Lydia's triumphant face. The cat that's gotten the cream. She comes into the house with Wickham. Her mother kisses her effusively. Mr. Bennet coldly bows.
And then we passed our Sims in a carriage, so I took off my glove and let my hand just rest on the window frame so she might see the ring, and then I bowed and smiled like anything.
Kitty shrieks with envy. Lizzie moves away. She cannot bear it. Wickham catches her eye, but she ignores him. Inside the dining room, they are taking their seats for dinner. Lydia moves to the head of the table.
Jane, I take your place now, and you must go lower, for I am the married woman.
She sits down and giggles at her sisters. The maid brings in the food. Lydia holds up her hand to display the ring to the maid.
You must all go to Brighton, for that is the place to get husbands. I hope you have half my good luck.
Lydia!
Wickham looking uncomfortable. He is talking to the stone-faced Mr. Bennet.
I've enlisted in a regiment in the north of England, sir.
I'm glad to hear it.
Near Newcastle, we shall travel there next week.
Can I come stay with you?
That is out of the question.
When Monday morning came and I was in such a fuss.
I don't want to hear.
There's my aunt preaching and talking away as if she was reading a sermon. She was horridly unpleasant.
Can't you understand why?
But I didn't hear a word because I was thinking of my dear Wickham. I longed to know whether he could be married in his blue coat.
The north of England, I believe, boasts some spectacular scenery.
And then my uncle was called away from the church on business, and I thought, who's to be our best man if he doesn't come back? Luckily, he did come back, or I would have had to ask Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Darcy?
I forgot. I shouldn't have said a word.
Mr. Darcy was at your wedding.
He was the one that discovered us. He knew where to find Wickham, you see. But don't tell anyone. He told me not to tell.
Lizzie stares at her. Darcy at her wedding? Lydia turns away to talk to the others. Outside in the garden, Lydia, croquet mallet in hand, drags her new husband across the lawn. Kitty follows.
Come on, Wickham. You've got to play.
Yes, come on.
Wickham looks slightly abashed, a trapped man. What has he let himself in for? Lizzie comes into the garden, looking for her younger sister. Wickham detaches himself and comes over to her, a rueful smile.
I hope we can be even better friends now we're brother and sister.
An attempt at a twinkling smile, but Elizabeth is now immune to his charm. She nods briefly.
I hear you visited Pemberley, my dear old home.
I met Mr. Darcy's sister.
Did you like her?
Very much. We found a great deal to talk about.
A beat. Wickham looks deeply uneasy. He bows and leaves. Lizzie watches him pick up a mallet and take his turn. She can't bear it. She hurries up to Lydia and draws her aside.
Why was Mr. Darcy there?
I'm not supposed to tell.
Lizzie abandons her pride. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
Please, Lydia.
Because he paid for it.
For what?
The wedding, Wickham's commission, everything.
Everything?
Lydia! Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Everything? Everything!
It's your turn.
People kept saying Wickham owed them money. It was so tedious. So Darcy settled his debts, but I don't really like him. Do you?
Why did he do it?
I don't know, do I? Anyway, you're not to tell because it's supposed to be our uncle who paid, and he wouldn't have minded paying either because I'm his favorite.
She leaves, giggles and shrieks from the croquet lawn. Elizabeth looks blank with shock. Outside of Bingley's house, close on Darcy's grimly determined face. Drawing back, we see that he is walking down a street in Mayfair. He arrives at a house, pauses, and rings the bell. The door is opened.
Mr. Darcy.
I have some business with Mr. Bingley.
Darcy goes inside and the door shuts. The camera cranes slowly upstairs until we can see through the first floor window and into the drawing room. Mr. Darcy enters and bows to Mr. Bingley. He starts to talk in earnest. Bingley looks stunned by what Darcy is relaying to him. We witness the dumb show of Darcy confessing that he has wronged Jane Bennet. Outside of Longbourn, Lydia and Wickham are leaving. Mr. Bennet stands at a distance. Mrs. Bennet sobs as Lydia climbs into the carriage.
Write me often, my dear.
Please relay my affections to the Darcys on your next acquaintance. I'm sure he will be pleased to hear things have worked out so well.
Married women never have much time for writing. My sisters may write to me. They'll have nothing else to do.
The Mrs. Bennet and the girls watch as the carriage drives away.
Oh, there is nothing so bad as parting with one's children. One seems so forlorn without them.
That is the consequence of marrying a daughter. It must make you better satisfied that your other four are single.
Outside in Meryton Village, Elizabeth and Jane are out shopping with their mother and sisters. Their housekeeper, Mrs. Hill, comes out of the butcher shop.
Hear the news, madam. Mr. Bingley is returning to Netherfield.
Mr. Bingley?
Miss Nichols is ordering a hunch of pork, for she expects him for tomorrow.
Tomorrow? Not that I care about it. Mr. Bingley is nothing to us, and I'm sure I never want to see him again. No, we shall not mention a word about it. Is it quite certain that he's coming?
Yes, madam. I believe he is alone. His sister remains in town.
Huh. Come along, girls.
Their mother goes into the draper's shop. Jane pauses at the threshold.
It's all right, Lizzie. I'm just glad that he comes alone, because then we shall see less of him. Not that I'm afraid of myself, but I dread other people's remarks.
A brave smile. Lizzie, of course, is not convinced in the slightest. They go into the shop. Outside of Longbourn, Mr. Bingley rides towards the house, a look of slight trepidation in his eyes. Darcy now comes into view riding alongside him. They cross the moat bridge. In the drawing room, Mary is practicing her scales. Jane and Elizabeth are sitting at their work with their mother. Kitty rushes in.
He is here! He is here! He's at the door!
Oh my goodness. Everybody act naturally.
Jane completely freezes. Everyone else goes into a fluster.
Whatever you do, do not appear overbearing.
Kitty looks out through a window.
Look, there's someone with him. Mr. What's-his-name? The pompous one from before.
Elizabeth looks through the window at Darcy. Her heart leaps into her mouth.
Mr. Darcy, indeed. The very insolence of it. What does he think of coming here?
Elizabeth returns to her seat and sits down, heavily. Mrs. Bennet hurries over to Jane and pinches her cheeks.
Mamma! Stop that and sit down. Find yourself some work. Oh, Lord.
They sit there, frozen, pretending to sew. The drawing room door opens and Mrs. Hill shows in the two men. They bow. Bingley smiles warmly at Jane, who blushes. Elizabeth glances at Darcy. Her face is strained. Mrs. Bennet is all smiles for Bingley. She ignores Darcy.
How very glad we are to see you, Mr. Bingley. There are a great many changes since you went away. Miss Lucas is married and settled, and one of my own daughters, too. You will have seen it in the papers, though. It was not put in as it ought to have been. Very short, nothing about her family.
I did hear of it, and offer my congratulations.
But it's very hard to have my Lydia taken away from me. Mr. Wickham has been transferred to Newcastle, wherever that is. Thank heavens he has some friends.
Mrs. Bennet shoots a frosty glance at Mr. Darcy. This is more than Elizabeth can bear.
Do you hope to stay long in the country, Mr. Bingley?
Just a few weeks for the shooting.
When you've killed all your own birds, Mr. Bingley, I beg you will come here and shoot as many as you please.
Thank you.
Mr. Bennet will be vastly happy to oblige you and will save all the best of the coffees for you.
Excellent.
Are you well, Mr. Darcy?
Well, thank you.
I hope the weather stays fine for your sport.
I return to town tomorrow.
So soon?
My Jane is looking well, does she not?
Mr. Bingley stands abruptly.
She does indeed. Well, I must be going, I suppose. Darcy?
Darcy cannot quite believe it. He gives Bingley a harsh stare. Bingley has not completed his task.
It was very pleasant to see you all again. Elizabeth, Miss Jane.
Bingley can almost not bear to look at Jane in the eye, and he acknowledges them all very briefly and bolts to the door. Mrs. Bennet fusses around him.
You must come again, for when you were in town last winter, you promised to take a family dinner with us. I have not forgotten, you see, at least 3 courses.
Bingley and Darcy take their leave, leaving the Bennets sitting in silence, all looking at one another. Kitty is fit to burst out laughing, Elizabeth and Jane horrified by the awkward visit. Outside on the lane, Bingley is pacing backwards and forwards in despair, muttering to himself. Darcy looks at him in extreme frustration.
Damn, buttery damn.
What are you thinking of?
It's as if Bingley has not heard. He keeps pacing up and down.
Damn blast, oh buttery damn.
Inside the drawing room, the girls are now spread around the room, Jane in despair.
Well, I'm glad that's over. We can now meet as indifferent acquaintances.
Oh, yes. Jane, take care.
You cannot think me so weak as to be in danger now.
I think you are in great danger of making him as much in love with you as ever.
I'm sorry, though, that he came with Mr. Darcy.
Jane, I've acted so stupidly. Had I been in love, I could not have been more blind.
What do you mean?
The doorbell rings.
It is him! He's back! He's come again!
Everyone has regained their decorous positions. They hear Bingley's voice at the door, and he comes in very awkwardly. He smiles. His face is crimson with embarrassment.
I know this is all very embarrassing, but I would like to request the privilege of speaking with Miss Jane. Alone.
Girls, everybody to the kitchen immediately. Oh, Mr. Bingley, it is so good to see you again so soon.
She ushers everyone out, not before squeezing Jane's hand. Now Jane and Bingley are alone, facing each other with extreme embarrassment.
Miss Bennet, you have been the victim of a huge misunderstanding. Suffice to say, I have been an unmitigated and uncomprehensive ass, and therefore I would like to ask you.
Outside in the hallway, Mrs. Bennet, Kitty, Mary, and Mr. Bennet are all jostling for a position at the door in order to overhear events inside. Elizabeth is apart from her family. She cannot bear to be there. She walks down the corridor and out of the house into the garden. Through a window, she sees Bingley on one knee. Her eyes fill with tears as she walks away from the house. Inside of the drawing room, Bingley looks at Jane, desperately worried. A pause.
Yes, 100 times. Yes.
Mrs. Bingley and the girls throw open the double doors to the drawing room and come crashing in. Bingley and Jane beam at them.
Thank the Lord for that. I thought it would never happen.
Outside in the garden, Elizabeth is sat under a tree crying. Outside in the countryside, overlooking Longbourn, Darcy looks down at Longbourn. Inside the bedroom, Longbourn is Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet are in bed.
I am sure they will do well together. Their tempers are much alike. They will be treated assiduously by their servants and be so generous with the rest. They will always exceed their income.
Exceed their income. He has 5,000 a year. I knew she could not be so beautiful for nothing.
The camera moves through to another bedroom where Mary is reading a book out loud to Kitty, then yet another room. In Elizabeth's room, Jane and Elizabeth lie in bed.
He has made me so happy. You know, he was totally ignorant of my being in town last spring.
How did he account for it?
He thought me indifferent.
Unfathomable.
No doubt poisoned by his pernicious sister.
Bravo. That's the most unforgiving speech you've ever made.
Oh, Lizzie, if I could but see you so happy, if there was such another man for you.
There's a noise outside.
Perhaps, if I get very good luck, I may meet with another Mr. Collins in time. What is that?
More noise. It sounds like a carriage, then a loud banging on the door downstairs. The girls look at each other. Downstairs, Mr. Bennet, Mrs. Bennet, and the girls, lit only by candles, have gathered. The door bangs again.
Maybe he's changed his mind.
Timidly, Mr. Bennet opens the door, revealing a wide-eyed Lady Catherine de Bourgh. Everyone gasps.
Lady Catherine.
Lady Catherine does not acknowledge her, but comes in uninvited, inspecting the assembled company of aghast Bennets.
And these are your daughters, I suppose?
All but one. The youngest has been lately married, your ladyship, and my eldest was only proposed to yesterday afternoon.
You have a very small garden, madam.
I'm sure it's nothing compared to Rosings, but it is larger than Sir William Lucas's, I can assure you.
Can I offer you a cup of tea, perhaps?
Absolutely not. I must speak to Miss Elizabeth alone, as a matter of complete urgency.
The Bennets all look at each other, bewildered by the strange turn of events. Inside the drawing room, Elizabeth leads the way into the room, lights an oil lamp. Lady Catherine walks in. The door closes behind them.
You can be at no loss, Miss Bennet, to understand why I'm here.
Lit only by the oil lamp, Lady Catherine resembles a flickering ghoul.
Indeed, you are mistaken. I cannot account for this honor at all.
Miss Bennet, I warn you. I am not to be trifled with. A report of a most alarming nature has reached me that you intend to be united with my nephew, Mr. Darcy. I know this to be a scandalous falsehood, though not wishing to injure him by supposing it possible, I instantly set off to make my sentiments known.
If you believed it impossible, I wonder you took the trouble to come in so far.
To hear it contradicted, Miss Bennet.
Your coming here would rather confirmation, surely, if indeed such a report exists.
If. Do you then pretend to be ignorant of it? Has it not been industriously circulated by yourself?
I have never heard of it.
And you can declare that there is no foundation for it.
I do not pretend to possess equal frankness with your ladyship. You may ask questions which I may not choose to answer.
This is not to be borne. Has my nephew made you an offer of marriage?
Your ladyship has declared it to be impossible.
Let me be understood. Mr. Darcy is engaged to my daughter. Now what have you say?
Only this. If that is the case, you can have no reasons to suppose he will make an offer to me.
You obstinate girl. This union has been planned since their infancy. Do you think it can be prevented by a young woman of inferior birth, of no importance in the world, and wholly unallied to his family, whose own sister's elopement resulted in the scandalously patched-up marriage only achieved at the expense of your uncle? Heaven and earth, are the shades of Pemberley to be thus polluted? Now tell me, once and for all, are you engaged to him?
I am not.
And will you promise never to enter into such an engagement?
I will not, and I certainly never shall. Allow me to say, the arguments which you have supported this extraordinary application have been as frivolous as the application was ill-judged. You have insulted me in every possible method, and can now have nothing further to say. I must ask you to leave immediately. Good night.
Elizabeth throws open the door, revealing the family outside.
I have never been thus treated in my entire life.
Lady Catherine storms past the family out into the night. Elizabeth is standing, shaking with excitement of having stood so firmly up for herself.
Lizzie, what on earth is going on?
Just a small misunderstanding.
She walks past them to bed.
Lizzie!
For once in your life, just leave me alone!
Everyone looks aghast at Elizabeth's reaction. Inside the bedroom, Jane is fast asleep. Elizabeth is unable to sleep. She quietly climbs out of bed and creeps out of the room. In the drawing room, Elizabeth sits alone, thinking. Outside, we see dawn is breaking. Outside of Longbourn, Elizabeth creeps into the garden and wanders around through the early morning mist as the sun starts to rise. Outside the countryside overlooking Longbourn, Elizabeth walks out into the open countryside. The mists are starting to evaporate. From out of the mist in the distance, a figure emerges. Her heart misses a beat. She's alone, vulnerable. Then she sees it as Darcy.
Mr. Darcy!
What are you doing out here so early?
I could not sleep.
Neither. I've been up most of the night.
Mr. Darcy, I must thank you for your unexampled generosity to both my sisters. I know what kindness you have done for poor Lydia, and I suspect your hand in the happy resolution for Jane also.
I'm alarmed that you know of what I have been so in earnest to keep silent, but you must know that your happiness was one of my prime inducements. I know you are too generous to trifle with me. I believe you spoke with my aunt last night, and it has taught me to hope, as I had scarcely allowed myself before. If your feelings are still what they were last April, tell me so at once. My affections and wishes are unchanged, but one word from you will silence me forever. If, however, your feelings have changed, I would have to tell you, you have bewitched my body, soul, and I have loved and love you. I never wish to be parted from you from this day on.
I am very happy to inform you that not only have my sentiments changed, there are no other words which could give me greater pleasure.
Darcy stares at her. They both start to cry. Darcy, very slowly and gently, touches her face. She closes her eyes. They kiss. She touches his face with her hand. The kiss becomes more passionate. Inside the drawing room at Longbourn, the place is in uproar. Bingley, Jane, Mary, Kitty, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet are all gathered, fretting terribly about Elizabeth's whereabouts. Through a window, we see Elizabeth led Darcy along the duckboard plank across the moat. Elizabeth enters the house. Everybody starts.
Lizzie, where have you been? We thought something had happened to you. Mr. Darcy, what on earth are you doing here?
Elizabeth takes Mr. Darcy's hand.
Mr. Darcy has come to speak with Papa.
Everyone is stunned. In the hallway and in the library, back and forth, Elizabeth paces outside the door of the library waiting. After a while, Darcy emerges. He gives Elizabeth the briefest of smiles and leaves the door open. Elizabeth walks in. Her father is in a state of shock.
Lizzie, are you out of your senses? I thought you hated the man.
No, Papa.
He is rich, to be sure, and you will have more fine carriages than Jane, but will that make you happy?
Have you no other objection other than your belief in my indifference?
None at all. We all know him to be a proud, unpleasant sort of fellow, but this would be nothing if you really liked him.
I do like him. I love him. He's not proud. It's I who's been prejudiced, who I didn't realize. You don't know him, Papa. If I told you what he's really like, what he's done.
What has he done?
Outside in the garden, Darcy, in agony, paces up and down the lawn. He looks at the library window. Cut back to the library. Mr. Bennet stares at his daughter.
Good Lord, I must pay him back.
No, you mustn't tell anyone. He wouldn't want it. We misjudged him, me more than anyone. In every way, not just in this matter. I've been so blind. He's been so blind. About Jane, about so many things. And so have I. You see, he and I are so similar, but so stubborn. Oh, Papa.
You do love him, don't you?
Very much.
I cannot believe that anyone can deserve you, but it seems I am overruled, so I heartily give my consent. I could not have parted with you, my Lizzie, to anyone else less worthy.
Oh, thank you.
She starts to rush out.
And if any young man come from Mary or Kitty, send them in, for I am quite at leisure.
Outside of Pemberley at night, we move through a vast wedding party following Elizabeth and Darcy. We meet all our characters. Lydia and Wickham are missing. Let everyone have an end. Darcy and Elizabeth kiss, then Darcy pulls Elizabeth off into the shadows. We see them disappear into the park. Coming close, we see them in the moonlight. It's Darcy and Elizabeth. Deer turn to gaze at them. The music fades as they walk further from the house up to the hill past the outcrops of rocks. An owl hoots. Darcy turns to Elizabeth and smiles.
Allow me, Mistress Darcy.
He puts out his hand. She takes it. He helps her up the rocks. Then they go to the top and sit there, side by side, and gaze at the distant lights of Pemberley.
How did it begin?
I cannot fix the hour, or the spot, or the look. It was too long ago, and I was in the middle before I knew it had begun.
Now be sincere. Did you admire me for my impertinence?
For the liveliness of your mind, I did.
You may as well call it impertinence, though make a virtue of it by all means. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible. And in return, it belongs to me to find occasion for teasing and quarreling with you as often and as maybe. And I shall begin directly.
We draw back. Their figures diminish, smaller and smaller under the immense star-spangled sky. Fainter and fainter, the sound of music and laughter. Fade to black, the end.
Aww. I like
Thank
the
God we didn't use the end.
better than
Yeah.
Yeah.
perfectly incandescently in love with you kind of thing. Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
No, I like this ending better. I don't like when they're like, call me Mrs. Darcy.
I always think that conversation is very sweet.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
when you call me when you're mad at me or when you
Yeah.
absolutely love me. Yeah, no, so good.
So good.
Well, thank you everyone for watching and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
I'm going